No heat, no shelter, no mercy. When the temperature dropped to 40 below and train winds hit 60 below, most people would die in minutes. But during the Great Depression, over 2 million Americans had no choice but to ride these deadly winter freight trains. They weren't thrill seekers, they were desperate people who'd lost everything, and somehow they survived conditions that would kill most of us today, even with our fancy modern gear. This is how they did it. If you fall asleep to these, hit subscribe. Also, comment where you're listening from. Got people from New York to Berlin last time. Kinda cool thinking we're all drifting off together. Tonight's stop, the frigid freight trains of 1930s America during the Great Depression. Get comfortable. Seriously, fix your pillow. Pull that blanket up, because where we're going, you'll want to be warm. December 1932, Chicago. Your eyes snap open to complete darkness. For a second, you don't know where you are, then it hits you all at once, the violent shaking beneath you, the roar of steel wheels on track, and the cold. Dear God, the cold. Your body is curled into a tight ball on the wooden floor of a freight car. Every breath creates a cloud that instantly disappears into the darkness. Your fingers are already numb. Your toes, you can't even feel them anymore. Unlike your warm bed right now, this wooden floor pulls the heat right out of your body, stealing it degree by degree. Jack Morgan, lucky to exactly nobody, had been on this train for maybe 20 minutes, and he was already wondering if they'd find his frozen body when they unloaded in Omaha. First night riding in winter, kid? The voice comes from the corner of the boxcar. Jack nearly jumps out of his skin. Jesus, who's there? Jack's voice cracks, betraying both fear and the first stages of hypothermia. A match strikes, illuminating a weathered face, deep wrinkles, grey stubble, eyes that have seen too much. The man looks like he's been riding these rails for 100 years. Name's Pete. Some folks call me Newspaper Pete. The match dies. Darkness again. And you, my friend, have about 15 minutes before you're in serious trouble. I'm fine, Jack stutters, teeth chattering uncontrollably. Pete's laugh is like gravel in a tin can. Yeah, and I'm the King of England. Listen, kid, it's 20 below out there. With this train moving at 40 miles an hour, that's a wind chill of about -60. You know what happens at -60? Before Jack can answer, Pete continues. Your skin freezes in under 5 minutes. Your core temperature drops so fast you get confused, then sleepy. That's the dangerous part, the sleeping. You lie down for a nap, you don't wake up. And judging by how you're shivering, you're already halfway there. Jack tries to stand, but his legs are wooden, unresponsive. The cold has taken deeper hold than he realized. I can't feel my feet, he admits. Another match flares. Pete is suddenly beside him, moving with surprising agility for a man his age. Thought so. First rule of winter riding, kid. You don't just hop a train with regular clothes and hope for the best. That's suicide. Pete's eyes narrow as he looks Jack over. Stock market? Jack nods. It's all most people need to say these days. The crash of 29 had taken everything. His job at the bank, his apartment, his fiancée. 3 years later, there were still men jumping from buildings in New York. Well, today's your lucky day, kid. You met me instead of the Grim Reaper. Now shut up and do exactly what I tell you. Pete reaches into a large sack and pulls out what looks like trash, newspapers, cloth strips, and what might once have been a canvas tarp. Take your coat off. Jack stares at him like he's insane. It's for freezing, Pete sighs. Kid, your cotton coat is worse than useless right now. It's soaked with your sweat from running to catch this train. Wet clothes kill in this weather. Now take it off before I have to drag your frozen corpse out of here in Iowa. Jack's fingers are too numb to work the buttons. Pete doesn't wait, just pulls a knife from his boot and slices them off in one quick motion. Hey, that was my only coat. and it was gonna be your death shroud. Now shut up and watch. I'm about to save your life with yesterday's Tribune. What happens next is like watching an artist at work. Pete's weathered hands move with practiced precision, unfolding newspapers and arranging them in specific patterns. The newspaper layer method, Pete explains, working quickly. Developed this myself over 4 winters on the rails. Newspapers got air pockets. Air pockets trap heat, but it's got to be done right. He starts with Jack's torso, wrapping sheets of newspaper around his chest and back in overlapping layers. Each sheet covers about 75% of the previous one, creating a seamless pattern. Gaps kill, Pete mutters as he works. One hole in your insulation and cold air gets in, warm air gets out. That's how you lose fingers and toes. The next 15 minutes are a masterclass in survival. Pete wraps Jack's entire body, torso, arms, legs, in layers of newspaper, securing each section with strips of cloth torn from what Jack realizes are old shirts and pants. Joints are tricky, Pete explains, paying special attention to Jack's elbows and knees. Movement creates tears, tears create gaps, gaps kill. He reinforces these areas with extra cloth and small pieces of canvas. "How do you know all this?" Jack asks, already feeling warmer despite being wrapped like a mummy in old Chicago Tribunes. Pete's eyes go distant for a moment. "Trial and error, kid. Lots of error. Saw too many frozen bodies my first winter. Men who thought a coat and a bottle of whiskey would keep them alive." He shakes his head. "Whiskey makes you feel warmer while it kills you faster, opens up your blood vessels, dumps all your heat out to your skin, then into the air." Jack is fascinated despite himself. "You learn this in the army or something?" "Nah, School of Hard Knocks. Now hold still." Pete pulls out a large overcoat, at least 2 sizes too big for Jack. "Charity bins special. Always go bigger in winter. Gotta fit all your newspaper layers underneath." The coat goes over Jack's newspaper-wrapped body. Then comes a canvas tarp, wrapped and secured with more cloth strips. Hand and foot protection next. Most important part, extremities freeze first. Jack's hands get wrapped in newspaper, then covered with wool socks, then enclosed in larger cloth bags that Pete tucks inside the coat sleeves. "Your feet are the biggest concern right now," Pete says, examining Jack's boots. "These are useless. Thin leather, probably wet inside from snow. Recipe for black toes." Black toes? Frostbite so bad they turn black and fall off. Seen it happen too many times. Jack feels sick. Pete doesn't seem to notice as he pulls off Jack's boots and socks in one motion. "Jesus, your feet are already white. Another hour and you'd be in trouble." Pete works even faster now. He wraps each of Jack's feet in newspaper, covers them with 3 pairs of socks pulled from his seemingly bottomless sack, and then produces a pair of oversized boots. Won't win any fashion contests, but they'll keep you alive, stuffed with more newspaper for insulation. The final touch is head protection. Pete wraps Jack's head and neck with newspaper, leaving only small openings for his eyes and mouth. Over this goes a wool cap and a scarf wrapped in an intricate pattern. "Up to 40% of your body heat escapes through an uncovered head," Pete explains. "That's why all these young bucks die even with coats on. Forget their heads, they might as well be naked in a blizzard." When Pete is finished, Jack looks like a bizarre mummy, wrapped in papers and rags. But the difference is immediate and shocking. For the first time since boarding the train, he's not shivering. Better, right? Pete grins, revealing several missing teeth. Now the important part, this isn't set and forget. Gotta check your layers every 30 minutes. Paper tears. You sweat. It gets wet. Wet paper doesn't insulate. He hands Jack a small waterproof bag made from oiled cloth. Spare newspapers and cloth strips. Learn to do repairs in the dark and check your fingers and toes every 15 minutes. Loss of feeling is your warning sign. Can't feel your pinky? Add more insulation or move around. Jack flexes his fingers inside their cloth cocoons. I can feel them again. It's amazing. Not amazing, just science and experience. Pete settles back into his corner of the car. Warm enough to hear a story now? Jack nods eagerly. There's something about this old hobo that commands respect. He's clearly survived conditions that have killed others. Good. 'Cause you need to understand what we're up against. Winter of 30, I was on a train like this one, headed through North Dakota. Temperature dropped to 40 below. Had a young guy with me, kinda like you. Name was Thomas, college boy who lost his scholarship when his daddy's business went bust. Pete's eyes go distant again, looking at something Jack can't see. He didn't listen, thought his fancy store-bought gloves were better than my newspaper method, found him in the morning, couldn't even close his eyes to bury him. They were frozen open. Jack swallows hard. Yeah, that's the reality out here. The freight cars don't care if you live or die. The weather sure as hell doesn't. The railroad bulls would rather beat you half to death than let you ride. Out here, the only thing between you and a frozen grave is what you know and how well you use it. Pete strikes another match, lights a small stub of candle. So I'm going to teach you everything. Not because I'm a nice guy, I'm not, but because winter riders look out for each other. It's the code. Someone taught me. Now I teach you. Someday you'll teach someone else. That's how we survive. The candle flickers, casting monstrous shadows across the boxcar walls. First lesson starts now. Take off your right mitten. Check your fingers. Tell me what you feel. Jack does as instructed. His fingers are pink again, with feeling returning in pins and needles. They hurt, actually. Good. Pain means blood flow. Dead tissue doesn't hurt. Now put that mitten back on before you lose what you've gained. For the next hour, as the train rumbles west through the frozen Illinois countryside, Pete teaches Jack the basics of the newspaper insulation system, the layers, the wrapping pattern, how to secure it, how to repair it, when to add more, when to adjust it. The whole system needs maintenance, Pete explains. Check every 30 minutes, replace wet or torn paper, re-secure loose wrappings. It's constant work, but that's the point. Keeps you moving, keeps blood flowing. Jack is a quick study, his banker's mind cataloguing the information methodically. How long have you been riding the rails? He asks during a pause in the lesson. Pete considers this. Since 29, was a carpenter before that, had a house in Tulsa, wife, 2 kids. He shrugs. Bank took it all. I worked at a bank, Jack admits quietly. Pete's laugh holds no humour. Ironic, ain't it? Don't worry, kid. I don't hold grudges. You were probably just a clerk, like most of the boys out here now. The real thieves are still eating steak in New York. A sudden lurch of the train sends them both sliding towards the boxcar door. Jack's heart leaps into his throat as he scrambles for purchase on the wooden floor. Rule 2 of winter riding, Pete says calmly, not even bothering to brace himself. Always know where you are in the car. Count paces from each wall. Know where the doors are. Know where the supports are. Your life might depend on grabbing something solid in the dark. As if to punctuate his point, the train takes a sharp curve and a blast of Arctic air knifes through the partially open boxcar door. Jack gasps as the cold finds the tiny gaps in his newspaper armour. Feel that? Pete asks. That's what kills. 1 minute you're fine in your layers. Next minute a door slides open wider or wind changes direction and suddenly you've got 60 below air hitting you. You've got maybe 2 minutes to react. What do I do if that happens? Jack asks, trying to keep the fear from his voice. Depends where it hits you. If it's your hands or feet, tuck them deeper into your coat. If it's your face, cover everything but your eyes with your scarf. If it's your whole body... Pete pauses. That's when you need shelter. And that's tomorrow's lesson. The train begins to slow, the rhythmic clacking of wheels changing pitch. "Water stop," Pete says, instantly alert. "Now you learn about bulls." Bulls? Railroad security. They find us, they beat us, arrest us, or just throw us off the moving train, especially in winter. They know it's a death sentence. Some of them enjoy that part. Jack feels a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature. What do we do? Pete is already gathering his few possessions. We move. Fast. Follow me and stay quiet. Remember Rule 3 of winter riding. Never stay in one car too long. Bulls check them at stops. The train slows further, brakes squealing. Pete moves to the door, peers out into the darkness. We've got about 2 minutes before they reach this section. We need to move 3 cars up. Can you make that in your new outfit? Jack tests his movement. The newspaper layers restrict him somewhat, but not as badly as he'd feared. I can make it. Pete nods approvingly. Good. Now watch me first. When the train stops completely, I'm going to slide this door wider, jump down, and run along the side to the 4th car up. Count them carefully. I'll be waiting at the door. If you don't make it in 1 minute, I'm closing the door to stay warm. Understand? Jack nods, heart pounding. "One more thing," Pete says, his voice deadly serious. "If you see a bull, don't run. Drop to the ground and roll under the nearest car. Rather risk them not seeing you than getting caught in the open. They will beat you unconscious and leave you to freeze." The train jerks to a final stop. Steam hisses in the cold night air. "Now!" Pete slides the door open and jumps down into the snow. Jack follows, awkwardly clambering down from the boxcar. His feet sink into snow up to his ankles, but thanks to Pete's newspaper-stuffed boots, he doesn't immediately feel the cold. The night is clear and star-filled, brutally cold. Jack's breath clouds around him as he starts running alongside the train, counting cars as he goes. He can see Pete's shape ahead, moving with surprising speed and grace for an older man. 1 car, 2 cars, 3 cars. Jack's lungs are burning from the cold air, each breath feeling like swallowing broken glass. The newspaper layers make running awkward, and he nearly falls twice. Ahead, Pete has reached the 4th car and is already climbing up. He turns to help Jack, just as a shout rings out from behind. "Hey, stop, right there!" Jack freezes, looking back to see a lantern bobbing in the darkness, moving toward them fast. "Bull!" Pete hisses. "Move your ass, kid!" Jack's survival instinct kicks in. He lunges forward, grabs Pete's outstretched hand, and scrambles up into the boxcar. Pete slides the door shut just as the lantern draws near, leaving only a tiny crack to peer through. "Don't make a sound," Pete whispers, his mouth right next to Jack's ear. They wait in absolute stillness, barely breathing. Outside, heavy footsteps crunch in the snow. A beam of light sweeps across the crack in the door. Jack's heart pounds so loudly he's certain it must be audible. The bull moves on, checking the next car. After what feels like an eternity, Pete relaxes slightly. He'll check the whole train, standard procedure at water stops, but we should be safe now. This boxcar is different from the last. It's a grain car with wooden walls that block more wind, but also more moonlight. The darkness is nearly absolute. "How do you see in here?" Jack whispers. "You don't. You feel." Pete's disembodied voice comes from somewhere to Jack's right. "Count steps. Remember where things are. Your eyes are useless most of the time out here." As they settle into their new temporary home, the train lurches and begins moving again. Jack feels a surge of relief, followed by exhaustion. The adrenaline of their escape, combined with the energy his body is using to stay warm, hits him all at once. "I'm so tired," he murmurs. "That's the cold talking," Pete says sharply. "Stay awake. Move your fingers and toes. Tell me about yourself." Not much to tell. Was a bank clerk in Chicago, had an apartment, a fiancée named Margaret, tickets to the Cubs. Jack trails off, the losses still too raw. "Keep talking," Pete insists. "Movement and conversation keep your blood flowing. Still got family. Parents in Milwaukee, too ashamed to go back. Dad warned me about the market. Should have listened." "Pride's a luxury out here," Pete says simply. "Cold kills the proud just as fast as the humble." "What about you?" Jack asks, fighting to keep his eyes open. "You mentioned Tulsa. Had a good life. Carpenter by trade. Built houses all through the 20s boom. Had a wife, Alice. Pretty as a picture. 2 boys, Michael and Thomas. What happened to them?" Pete is quiet so long, Jack thinks he won't answer. Finally, "Alice took the boys to her sister's in California. Told me to come when I could. That was 3 years ago. You never went?" "Started that way. Headed west. But the rails have a way of becoming home. Met others like me. Learned to survive. Taught others. Sent money when I could find work. Less shame in staying away than showing up broken." The rawness of Pete's admission hangs in the cold air between them. "Check your fingers and toes," Pete says abruptly, changing the subject. "Then I'll teach you about shelters, because this insulation system is just the beginning. Tomorrow you learn how to build a windbreak that can withstand 60-mile-per-hour gusts on a moving platform. After that, food and water systems that work when everything freezes solid." Jack flexes his fingers inside their newspaper and cloth wrappings. They're warm now, almost comfortable. "Oh, why are you helping me?" he asks suddenly. In the darkness, he hears Pete shifting position. "Told you, it's the code. Winter riders look out for each other." But Jack senses there's more. Is that the only reason? Pete is silent again, and when he speaks, his voice has lost its gruffness. "You remind me of someone. College boy who didn't listen. Thought he knew better than an old hobo." The train picks up speed, rushing westward through the frozen night. Jack waits, sensing Pete isn't finished. "My son, Thomas. Last letter from Alice said he left home to find me. That was last winter." Pete's voice is flat, emotionless. "Never found him, but I find boys like you instead. Maybe someone found him, taught him what I'm teaching you." The implications sink into Jack's mind like stones into a still pond. "I'm sorry," he says inadequately. "Don't be sorry. Be smart. Be alive in the morning." Pete's voice regains its edge. "Now, about those shelters." The train thundered through the night, steel wheels pounding a hypnotic rhythm on the frozen tracks. Inside the grain car, Pete was using the faint moonlight seeping through cracks to demonstrate the finer points of newspaper insulation. "Most folks who try this get the basic idea but miss the details," Pete explained, adjusting the layers around Jack's wrists. "See how I'm overlapping these edges? That's critical. Creates a seal that traps body heat." Jack nodded, fascinated despite his exhaustion. The cold that had nearly killed him an hour ago was now held at bay by nothing more than yesterday's news and some cloth strips. "But this is just emergency protection," Pete continued. "Gets you through the first night. Real winter riders need shelter systems, especially in cars like this where the wind finds every crack." Pete moved to the corner of the boxcar, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness. "This is where you want to be. Corner gives you 2 walls, cuts wind exposure in half." He pulled items from his pack, what looked like wooden slats, a coil of rope, and canvas scraps. Always collect materials during daylight stops. Railroad yards are full of useful junk if you know what to look for. Won't the bulls catch you scavenging? Jack asked. Pete's laugh was dry. Bulls patrol riding spots, not scrap piles. Look like you belong. Walk with purpose. Nobody looks twice. Jack watched as Pete began constructing something in the corner. Even in near darkness, his movements were precise, practiced. What are you building? Corner shelter, triangular windbreak, gives maximum protection with minimum materials. Pete worked methodically, positioning a horizontal support beam across the corner approximately 4 feet from the floor. He secured it with rope to create a frame that extended about 6 feet along each wall. Framework has to support covering materials while resisting wind pressure. On a moving train at 45 miles per hour, that's like a constant hurricane. Jack moved closer, intrigued. Where did you learn engineering like this? Told you I was a carpenter. Built houses for 15 years. Same principles apply, just smaller scale and moving at 50 miles per hour. Pete positioned vertical supports every 2 feet along the horizontal beam, creating a framework that looked surprisingly solid. Now for the covering system. This is where most folks mess up. They use a single layer, wind tears it apart in minutes. From his seemingly bottomless pack, Pete produced a folded canvas tarp, several blankets, and more newspapers. Multiple layers, outer layer deflects wind and moisture. He stretched the canvas over the framework, securing it with rope at multiple points. Has to be drum tight. Any flapping tears the material and creates noise. Noise attracts bulls. Next came the inner layer. Blankets positioned about 6 inches inside the canvas, creating an air gap. Air gap is crucial. Extra insulation. Same principle as the newspaper layers on your body. Pete then addressed the floor. Ever notice how cold seeps up through your feet when standing on ice? Same thing happens in a metal boxcar. Floor barrier is critical. He laid down cardboard, newspaper, and a thin blanket, extending about 2 feet beyond where they would sit. Thermal barrier prevents cold transfer from the metal floor, saves your ass, literally. Sit directly on metal at these temperatures and your backside freezes in minutes. Jack was impressed. The makeshift shelter looked surprisingly effective, creating a protected space in the corner of the otherwise brutally cold boxcar. What about getting in and out? Jack asked. Entrance system, Pete said, demonstrating an overlapping flap in the covering. Opens from inside, seals tight when closed. Position it away from the wind direction. Creates a vestibule area for removing snow and ice before entering the main shelter. Jack nodded, trying to memorize every detail. His life might depend on this knowledge soon. Ventilation control next, Pete continued. Carbon monoxide is a killer in enclosed shelters, needs small adjustable openings near the top. He indicated small flaps that could be opened or closed, positioned to create air circulation without drafts. Can be quickly sealed if temperatures drop too low. The entire structure was anchored to solid parts of the boxcar with an intricate web of ropes. Anchor system distributes stress across the framework, has to flex with train movement while maintaining structural integrity. Pete stepped back, surveying his work. Quick release connections here and here. He pointed to specific knots. If bulls discover us, shelter can be dismantled in seconds. All materials arranged for rapid packing. The lesson continued, with Pete explaining how to monitor weather from inside the shelter, small observation ports that could be opened to check conditions without exposing the entire shelter to wind and cold. Temperature monitoring is simple. Watch your breath. See ice forming on shelter walls. Adjust ventilation accordingly. When the shelter was complete, Pete gestured for Jack to enter. The difference was immediate and remarkable. Outside, the boxcar was a frozen metal tomb. Inside Pete's shelter, it was merely cold rather than lethal. "This is amazing," Jack said, genuine admiration in his voice. Pete shrugged off the compliment. "Not amazing. Necessary. Now get some sleep. I'll take first watch." "Watch for what?" "Bulls, weather changes, unexpected stops, sleep in shifts, standard procedure for winter riding." Jack wanted to protest, to offer to take the first watch, but exhaustion was quickly overwhelming him. The newspaper insulation combined with the shelter created enough warmth for his body to finally relax. 2-hour shifts, Pete said firmly. "I'll wake you. Remember to check your extremities every time you wake up. Frostbite can happen during sleep without you feeling it." Jack nodded, already drifting. The last thing he heard before sleep claimed him was Pete's voice, surprisingly gentle. "You did good tonight, kid. Most newcomers don't make it past the first hour." Jack woke to Pete's hand, gently shaking his shoulder. "Your watch, kid. 2 hours till dawn." Jack blinked, disoriented. For a moment he was back in his Chicago apartment, waking for his shift at the bank. Then reality crashed back. The boxcar, the cold, his new life as a hobo. "Check your fingers and toes," Pete reminded him. Jack did as instructed. Everything still had feeling, though his feet were colder than he'd like. "Feet are a bit numb," he admitted. Pete nodded. "Common after sleeping. Blood flow decreases. Move them around, get circulation going." Jack flexed his feet inside their newspaper wrappings, feeling pins and needles as warmth returned. "While you do that, I'll teach you the maintenance routine," Pete said. Over the next 30 minutes, Pete demonstrated how to check and repair the newspaper insulation system. Certain areas, armpits, groin, behind the knees, created more moisture from sweat. These needed more frequent replacement. "Wet newspaper is worse than no insulation," Pete explained. "Conducts cold directly to your skin." He showed Jack how to replace sections without removing the entire system, working in small areas to maintain overall warmth. "Your body is the furnace. These layers just keep the heat from escaping. Lose too many layers at once, furnace can't keep up." Jack was a quick study, his hands becoming more confident as he practiced the techniques. "What's our plan?" he asked as they finished the maintenance routine. "Where's this train headed?" "West," Pete said simply. "Probably Denver eventually, but we'll likely jump off before then." "Why not ride it all the way?" "Oh, longer rides mean more risks. More bulls, more weather changes, more chances for something to go wrong. Winter riding is about short hops between safe spots." "Safe spots?" "Hobo jungles near rail yards, places to warm up, get real food, share information, network of spots across the country, some better than others in winter." Jack nodded, filing away this new information. "And where are we going?" "Junction City, Kansas. Good winter jungle there. Man named Boxcar Bill runs it. Best shelter builder on the rails. Makes my setups look amateur." Pete gestured for Jack to take position by the small observation port. "Watch duty, look for lights, listen for changes in train rhythm. Wake me for any of these. Bulls with flashlights, trains slowing unexpectedly, sudden weather changes, or sunrise." With that, Pete curled up in the corner of their shelter and was asleep almost instantly, a skill Jack envied. Alone with his thoughts, Jack stared out the tiny port. The landscape was a moonlit blur of snow-covered fields and occasional distant farmhouses, each showing warm, golden windows that stirred painful memories of the life he'd lost. Margaret would be waking soon in the apartment they once shared, now occupied by her and her new fiancé, a doctor who hadn't lost everything in the crash. Jack didn't blame her. 3 years was a long time to wait for a man to rebuild his life, especially when that man kept sliding lower instead of recovering. The train began to slow. Jack tensed, remembering Pete's warnings. He watched intently for lights that would indicate bulls, but saw none. Still, the train continued decelerating. "Pete," Jack whispered, gently shaking the older man's shoulder. "Train's slowing. Don't see any bulls, though." Pete was instantly alert, no trace of sleepiness. "Where are we?" he asked, moving to the observation port. "No idea. Just fields as far as I can see." Pete studied the terrain, then relaxed slightly. Water stop at Solomon Creek. No station, just a water tower. Bulls rarely check these stops, but stay alert. The train ground to a halt. In the sudden silence, Jack could hear water rushing, presumably into the locomotive's tanks. "Quick lesson," Pete said softly. "Water stops last about 15 minutes. Perfect time for shelter maintenance without the train movement making everything harder." He showed Jack how to tighten loose supports, adjust ventilation based on changing wind directions, and reinforce stress points that had weakened during travel. "Every stop is an opportunity," Pete explained. "Fix what needs fixing, never waste a stable platform." The stop also gave Pete a chance to evaluate their insulation layers in better light from the moonlight streaming through the larger cracks of the stationary boxcar. "You're doing well with the newspaper method, but your elbow wrapping is loose. See how the papers shift when you move your arm? That's a cold spot waiting to happen." He demonstrated the correct technique, overlapping papers with tighter cloth bindings that still allowed movement. Balance is key. Too tight restricts blood flow, causes frostbite. Too loose lets cold air in, also causes frostbite. Both end with missing fingers and toes. Jack practiced under Pete's watchful eye until he got it right. "You're a natural," Pete admitted grudgingly. "Most folks take days to master this." "Had a good teacher," Jack replied. A whistle blew from the locomotive. "Departure signal," Pete said. "Back to positions." The train lurched forward, beginning its westward journey once more. As they settled in, Jack's curiosity got the better of him. "How'd you end up on the rails, Pete?" "Really?" Pete was quiet so long Jack thought he wouldn't answer. "Told you, lost everything in 29. "There's more to it," Jack pressed gently. "Nobody becomes an expert like you without a story." Pete sighed, a sound almost lost beneath the clacking of the train wheels. "Was a master carpenter in Tulsa. Had my own business, built houses for oil money folks. Good life." Pete's voice was matter-of-fact, free of self-pity. "When the crash hit, buildings stopped overnight, tried to hold on, took odd jobs, repair work. Wasn't enough." He shifted, the newspaper layers crinkling with his movement. "Bank foreclosed in spring of 30. Alice took the boys to her sister's in Sacramento. Plan was I'd follow once I got back on my feet." "But you didn't go," Jack prompted when Pete fell silent. "Started that way, hopped my first freight that summer, thought I'd work my way west, job to job." "What happened?" "First winter happened." Pete's voice turned grim. "Was riding with 5 other men in a boxcar like this one. None of us knew what we were doing. Temperatures dropped to 30 below near Flagstaff." Jack waited, sensing Pete needed to tell this story at his own pace. "Woke up. 2 men were already dead, frozen solid. 3rd was delirious, too far gone to save. 4th lost both feet to frostbite, died of infection weeks later. And the 5th man taught me everything he knew about winter survival. Old railroad worker named Henry. Said knowledge was the only currency that mattered in cold like that." Pete fell silent again, lost in memories. "We rode together that whole winter. Henry showed me the newspaper method, the shelter systems, everything. By spring, I was helping him teach others." "What happened to Henry?" "Bulls caught him near Omaha, beat him so bad his ribs punctured a lung. Died 3 days later in a jungle outside the city." The brutality of life on the rails hung heavy in the cold air between them. After that, I just kept going, east in summer, south in winter, learning more techniques, teaching when I could, sending money to Alice when I found work. You never tried to reach California. Pete's laugh held no humour. Sent a letter once I had the newspaper method perfected. Told Alice I was coming. She wrote back that Thomas had left home to find me, said he was riding the rails, looking for his father. Jack understood now. That's why you're out here still, looking for him. Pete nodded. Been 3 years, ridden every major line, checked every jungle, asked every rider I meet. No sign of him? Stories, rumours. Boy fitting his description seen in Denver, in Seattle, in Chicago. Always just missed him, or wasn't him at all. The train took a sharp curve, and both men braced themselves against the shelter wall. So I keep riding, Pete continued once the train straightened out. Keep teaching. Figure if I can't find him, maybe I can make the rails safer for him, and for boys like you who don't know any better than to jump a freight in winter with nothing but a thin coat. Jack didn't know what to say. The man's dedication to finding his son was both heartbreaking and admirable. We'll find him, Jack said finally, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. Pete gave him a long look. Maybe. But first, we need to find Junction City and Boxcar Bill, because my newspaper trick and corner shelter are just the basics. Bill's the real master of winter survival. A thought occurred to Jack. Could your son have found Bill too, if Bill's so well known? Pete's eyes widened slightly, as if this possibility hadn't occurred to him. Been through Junction City 4 times in 3 years. Never thought to ask Bill specifically about Thomas. He shook his head, getting sloppy, too focused on moving, not enough on asking the right questions. We'll ask him together, Jack said firmly. Pete nodded, a new determination visible even in the dim light. First, you need to master this, Pete said, returning to the lesson, because Junction City is still 12 hours away, and this storm isn't done with us yet. Jack followed Pete's gaze to the observation port, where snowflakes had begun swirling more thickly in the moonlight. Blizzard coming, Pete said grimly, barometric pressures dropping. Can feel it in my bad knee. What does that mean for us? Means we're about to test everything I taught you under the worst possible conditions. Pete reached into his pack and pulled out more newspapers and cloth strips. Double layer everything, reinforce all stress points. This is no drill, kid. Storm like this can kill even experienced riders if they get careless. They worked in focused silence, adding layers to their insulation systems and reinforcing the shelter. Pete was methodical, his decades of experience evident in every precise movement. Too many folks panic in blizzards, Pete explained as they worked. Waste energy, sweat through their layers, create moisture that freezes. Stay calm, work smart. Outside their shelter, the wind picked up, whistling through the boxcar's seams. Snow began to accumulate on the observation port. Close all but one ventilation opening, Pete instructed. Keep that one just barely open. Need airflow, but minimal heat loss. Jack followed Pete's instructions exactly, understanding now that these weren't just lessons, they were the difference between life and death. What about food? Jack asked suddenly, realizing he hadn't eaten since the previous morning. Winter riding rule, always carry emergency rations. Pete reached into an inner pocket and produced 2 hard biscuits and what looked like a strip of dried meat. Hardtack and jerky, not fancy but won't freeze solid like other foods. He broke each in half, giving Jack a portion that seemed meagre but was clearly valuable in these conditions. Eat slowly, small bites, let it soften in your mouth before swallowing, conserves water. Jack took a bite of the hardtack. It was like trying to eat a brick, but following Pete's advice, he let it soften before attempting to chew. Water is trickier, Pete continued. Canteens freeze in these temperatures. He showed Jack a small metal flask tucked against his body under several newspaper layers. Body heat keeps it liquid. Small sips only. When it runs low, we'll melt snow using body heat. As they ate their sparse meal, the storm intensified. The boxcar shuddered against powerful gusts, and the temperature dropped noticeably despite their shelter. "Storm's worse than I thought," Pete admitted, peering through the observation port at the white void outside. "Train might stop if the tracks drift over. Is that bad? Depends where it stops. Middle of nowhere? Very bad. Near a town? Workable." Jack tried to keep his rising anxiety in check. He'd survived one night thanks to Pete's knowledge. Surely they could weather this storm too. "What's the worst winter situation you've faced?" Jack asked, partly to distract himself, partly to learn. Pete considered the question. "Winter of 31, Nebraska. Train got stranded in a blizzard like this one. 12 of us trapped in 3 boxcars. What happened?" "Temperature hit 35 below. Wind gusts to 60 miles per hour. No towns for miles. No rescue coming." Pete's eyes took on that distant look again, seeing something far away in time. Man named Eddie took charge, called himself Emergency Eddie, had been a medic in the Great War, organised us into a survival unit. Jack leaned forward, invested in the story, despite his fear of the howling storm outside. Eddie had us combine our individual shelters into one larger structure, positioned everyone in a circle with the weakest in the centre, created a rotation system so everyone got time in the warmest spots. Did it work? Pete nodded. 2 days we were stranded there. Temperature never rose above 20 below, but everyone survived. Eddie saved 12 lives with his system. Where is he now? Last I heard, riding the Union Pacific lines out of Omaha. Man's a legend among winter riders. The train began to slow again, the change in rhythm immediately noticeable. Pete frowned. Not a scheduled stop, could be drifts on the track. They waited in tense silence as the train ground to a complete halt. The sudden stillness was almost more unnerving than the movement had been. "Now we wait," Pete said calmly. "Could be minutes, could be hours." "What if it's days?" Jack asked, voicing his worst fear. "Then we implement Eddie's protocols." Pete's voice was steady, reassuring. "We have shelter, we have basic food and water, we have knowledge. 3 most important survival tools." Outside, the blizzard raged, snow and wind turning the world into a frozen hell. But inside their tiny shelter, constructed of scavenged materials and newspaper, they had created a space where survival was possible. "Get some rest," Pete suggested. "I'll wake you if anything changes." Jack nodded, suddenly exhausted again. The combination of stress, cold, and his body's efforts to stay warm was draining his energy. "Tomorrow," Pete said, as Jack settled into the corner of their shelter, "I'll teach you the full details of the insulation system. Every layer, every wrapping pattern, every securing technique. By the time we reach Junction City, you'll be able to build this in total darkness during a blizzard." "If we reach Junction City," Jack couldn't help adding. Pete's face was serious in the dim light. "We'll reach it. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not the next day, but we'll get there. Know why?" Jack shook his head. "Because giving up isn't an option out here. The minute you think you might not make it is the minute you start making fatal mistakes. On the winter rails, confidence isn't a luxury. It's a survival tool." With that wisdom echoing in his mind, Jack closed his eyes. The last thing he heard before drifting off was Pete's voice, reciting what sounded like a mantra. The railroad don't care if you freeze. The weather don't care if you starve. The only thing between you and death is what you know and how well you can use it when everything goes wrong. Jack woke to silence. The constant rumble of wheels on tracks that had been his lullaby was gone, replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by the occasional moan of wind. "We stopped?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. Pete nodded, peering through the observation port. Sometime in the night, snows drifted over the tracks ahead, crews probably waiting for a plough. How long will that take? Could be hours, could be days. Pete didn't sugarcoat it. Blizzards let up a bit, but we're not going anywhere soon. Jack felt a surge of panic that he fought to control. Stranded in the middle of nowhere in sub-zero temperatures wasn't how he'd planned to die. "Relax, kid," Pete said, reading his expression. "This ain't my first rodeo, or my first stranded train." He gestured to their shelter. "We've got protection from the elements, we've got some food and water, and most importantly, we know how to not die in this weather. That puts us ahead of most folks out there." Jack nodded, trying to find confidence in Pete's calm demeanor. "Now check your extremities," Pete instructed. "Fingers and toes, tell me what you feel." Jack wiggled his fingers inside their cloth coverings. They were cold but responsive. His toes were similarly chilled but not numb. He reported this to Pete, who nodded approvingly. "Good, time for insulation maintenance." They spent the next hour carefully replacing damp newspaper with dry sheets from Pete's waterproof bag, section by section, to avoid exposing too much skin to the cold at once. "The train not moving actually helps," Pete explained as they worked. "Less wind penetration, stable platform for repairs. Take advantage of it." As Jack finished rewrapping his left arm, a thought occurred to him. What about the other people on this train? There must be other riders. Pete's expression darkened. "Almost certainly. And if they don't know what we know, they're in trouble." Jack didn't need to ask what kind of trouble. He'd nearly frozen to death himself before Pete found him. "We should help them," Jack said firmly. Pete studied him for a long moment. "Risky. Moving between cars in this weather exposes us. Plus, not all riders welcome help." "You helped me. That's different." "How?" Pete didn't have a ready answer for that. "Look," Jack pressed. "You said it yourself. Winter riders look out for each other. It's the code." Pete sighed, a cloud of vapor in the frigid air. "You're using my words against me. Not fair." But there was no real resentment in his voice. "All right. We'll check the adjacent cars, but we move smart, stay together, and if I say we turn back, we turn back. Deal?" Jack nodded. "Deal." Preparing to venture outside their shelter took another 20 minutes. Pete insisted they add extra insulation layers, paying special attention to faces and extremities. "Winds died down, but it's still deadly out there," Pete warned. "Cover everything but your eyes and keep moving. Standing still is how you die." When they were fully wrapped, looking like bizarre mummies in their newspaper armor, Pete carefully dismantled part of their shelter entrance. "Ready?" he asked. Jack nodded, trying to project more confidence than he felt. Pete slid the boxcar door open just enough for them to slip through. The blast of cold that hit them was shocking despite their preparations. Jack gasped, the air burning his lungs. "Keep your scarf over your mouth," Pete reminded him. "Breathe through the fabric to warm the air." They jumped down into snow that reached mid-calf. The world around them was a white wasteland. The train stretched in both directions, half buried in drifts, looking like a great black serpent frozen in the snow. The sky was a flat grey, promising more snow to come. "Next car first," Pete said, his voice muffled by his scarf. "Move quick but careful. Fall in this cold. Get snow inside your layers. You're in trouble." They trudged through the snow alongside the train, each step requiring effort. Jack could already feel the cold trying to penetrate his newspaper armor, probing for weaknesses. The next car was another boxcar, its door frozen shut. Pete produced a metal tool from inside his coat and worked it into the gap, leveraging the door open with a screech of protesting metal. "Hello," Pete called into the darkness. "Anybody riding?" Silence answered him. "Empty," Pete concluded. "Let's check the next one." They continued down the line, checking each car. The third car held a surprise. A family of 4 huddled together in a corner, shivering violently in clothes woefully inadequate for the conditions. "Jesus," Pete muttered. Then, louder, "You folks all right?" The man looked up, his face pale with cold. "Who's asking?" "Name's Newspaper Pete. This is Jack. We're riders." "We're not looking for trouble," the man said warily. "Just trying to get to my brothers in Colorado. Lost our farm in Nebraska." Pete's voice softened. "Not here for trouble. Here to help. You and your family are in danger in this cold." The man's suspicion visibly warred with desperation. His wife and 2 small children, a boy and girl no older than 8, were clearly suffering. "What kind of help?" he finally asked. For the next hour, Pete taught the family his newspaper insulation technique using their own small supply supplemented with sheets from his waterproof bag. Jack helped, demonstrating what Pete had taught him the previous night. "Layers overlap like this," Jack explained to the woman as he showed her how to wrap her daughter's legs. "No gaps. Gaps let cold air in." Pete, meanwhile, was instructing the man on how to build a basic corner shelter using materials they had available. A tarp, some rope, and wooden slats pried from a broken crate. "Won't be pretty, but it'll cut the wind and trap some heat," Pete explained. The family's gratitude was palpable as their makeshift insulation and shelter began to take effect. Colour returned to the children's faces, and they stopped shivering quite so violently. "We can't thank you enough," the woman said, tears in her eyes. "We thought—" She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. "Winter riding has rules," Pete said simply. "First rule, knowledge gets shared. Someone taught me, I taught Jack, now we're teaching you. Someday, you'll teach someone else." The man nodded solemnly. "I won't forget this." "Make sure you don't," Pete replied, "because out here, what you know is the only thing standing between you and freezing to death." As they prepared to leave, the man introduced himself. "Name's Frank Miller. This is my wife Sarah, kids James and Rebecca." Pete hesitated, then asked, "You been riding long? Meet many other riders?" "About 2 months now. Met quite a few." "Why?" "I'm looking for someone. My son, name's Thomas, looks a bit like me but younger, dark hair, scar on his right cheek from a bicycle accident." Frank shook his head. "Sorry, haven't seen anyone matching that description." Pete nodded, disappointment evident despite his attempt to hide it. "If you do, tell him his father's looking for him, following the main lines. Junction City, Kansas is our next stop. We'll keep an eye out," Frank promised. Back outside, Pete and Jack continued their sweep of the train. 2 more cars yielded no riders, but in the 6th car they found an elderly man alone, nearly unconscious from hypothermia. "Bad case," Pete muttered, kneeling beside him. "Help me get his wet clothes off. They're worse than nothing at this point." Together, they stripped the old man of his sodden jacket and pants, replacing them with layer after layer of newspaper bound with cloth strips. "Got to warm his core first," Pete explained as they worked. "Extremities can wait. Heart needs to keep pumping." They wrapped the man in every dry blanket and piece of canvas they could find, then Pete instructed Jack to lie next to him. Body heat. Best way to warm someone in these conditions. Jack did as instructed, pressing himself against the shivering old man despite the discomfort and smell. Pete positioned himself on the other side, creating a human sandwich with the hypothermic man in the middle. Had a doctor in the Great War who saved men this way, Pete explained, called it the hobo heating system. 3 men survive where one would die. After what seemed like an eternity, the old man's violent shivering subsided and his breathing grew steadier. His eyes fluttered open, confusion evident. "What? Who are you fellas?" he croaked. "Just passing through," Pete said. "You were in trouble. Cold got to you." Understanding dawned on the old man's weather-beaten face. "Wouldn't be the first time. Name's Whiskey Joe. Been riding these rails since before you boys were born. You should know better than to wear wet clothes in this weather, Joe," Pete said. No judgment in his voice, just concern. "Fell asleep too close to the door. Snow blew in when the storm hit." Joe shook his head. "Rookie mistake. Getting old, I guess." "Happens to all of us," Pete replied. "You heading anywhere specific?" "Junction City. Got friends in the jungle there." Pete's eyebrows rose. "That's where we're headed. Know a man called Boxcar Bill?" Whiskey Joe grinned, revealing several missing teeth. "Bill? Course I know Bill. Best damn shelter builder on the rails. He expecting you?" "No, but I'm hoping he might have information about my son. Been looking for him 3 years now." Joe's expression turned sympathetic. "Lot of lost sons out here. What's his name?" "Thomas. Thomas Gardner." Joe shook his head. "Don't recall that name, but my memory ain't what it used to be. If anyone would know, it'd be Bill. Man hears everything." A whistle sounded from the front of the train. 3 short blasts. "Moving soon," Pete translated. "Plow must have cleared the tracks ahead." "You boys heading back to your car?" Joe asked. Pete glanced at Jack, a silent question passing between them. "Actually," Jack said, "think we'll ride with you for a while. Make sure you stay warm." Joe didn't argue, just nodded gratefully. For the next few hours, as the train slowly began moving again, Pete and Jack took turns checking on Joe and maintaining their insulation systems. Pete also took the opportunity to teach Jack more about winter survival on the rails. "Food's the next challenge," Pete explained. "Regular stuff freezes solid in these temperatures. Try biting into a frozen apple. You'll break your teeth." He showed Jack his food selection system. Bacon cut into small bite-sized pieces that could be chewed when frozen. Nuts ground into coarse meal that could be mixed with snow to create a nutritious paste. Dried meat cut into thin strips that could be softened by holding in the mouth until body heat made them chewable. "High-fat foods are gold out here," Pete continued. "Bacon, lard, nuts. Stay edible when frozen and provide essential calories for maintaining body heat." Joe nodded along. "Man knows his stuff. Seen too many boys starve because they couldn't figure out how to eat their frozen supplies. Water management's even trickier," Pete added. "Can't drink ice." He demonstrated his system of multiple small containers kept inside clothing against the body, rotating them every 30 minutes to keep the water liquid. "Never carry one big canteen," he warned. "Freezes solid, you're without water. Multiple small containers, always rotating." Joe chimed in with his own technique. "I use a metal cup held against my body to melt snow using body heat. Slow process, but reliable. Snow and ice melting technique saved my life more than once," Pete agreed. "Just be careful to use clean snow from areas away from railroad tracks and industrial pollution." As the day wore on, the train's pace increased, suggesting they were finally clear of the worst drifts. By late afternoon, Pete estimated they were nearing Junction City. "How do you know?" Jack asked, impressed by Pete's ability to track their location without any visible landmarks in the snow-covered landscape. "Count water towers," Pete explained. "Each main line has them at regular intervals. Also timing between curves, changes in track sound. After a while, you develop a mental map." Joe nodded sagely. "Man's got rail sense. Born with it, or learn it, can't fake it." The train began to slow again, but this time Pete seemed pleased rather than concerned. "Junction City water stop," he announced. "We'll jump here. Jungle's about half a mile east of the water tower." They gathered their meager belongings, Pete helping Joe with his while Jack disassembled the small shelter they'd constructed during the journey. "Remember," Pete instructed as they prepared to jump, "landing in snow is tricky. Roll if you can. Try to land on the balls of your feet, then collapse into the roll. Stiff legs break." The train had slowed considerably but was still moving at about 10 miles per hour as they slid the door open. The late afternoon sun had emerged from the clouds, creating a blinding glare off the snow. "Now," Pete called. One after another, they jumped. Jack landed awkwardly, but managed to roll as instructed, coming up covered in snow but unhurt. Pete and Joe had already risen and were brushing themselves off. "Jungle's this way," Joe said, pointing toward a distant tree line. "Best winter setup in 4 states." They trudged through the snow, their newspaper insulation holding up well against the cold, which Pete estimated at around 15 below zero, balmy compared to the previous night. As they approached the trees, Jack noticed smoke rising from multiple points. Drawing closer, he saw why. The jungle was an organized camp of hobos with carefully constructed shelters nestled among the trees, small fires burning in protected pits. "Welcome to Bill's place," Joe announced proudly. The jungle was unlike anything Jack had imagined. Instead of a haphazard collection of makeshift shelters, it was arranged with military precision. Shelters were positioned to block wind for each other. Smoking fires were kept downwind, and paths had been cleared through the snow. Men moved about with purpose, carrying wood, tending fires, repairing equipment. It looked less like a hobo camp and more like a frontier settlement. "Bill runs a tight operation," Pete explained, noting Jack's surprise. "Has to in winter. Disorder kills when it's this cold." They made their way toward the center of the camp, where a large structure stood out from the rest, built into the side of a small hill and reinforced with railroad ties. It looked surprisingly permanent. "Bill's headquarters," Joe explained. "Man's a genius with salvaged materials." As they approached, a tall, broad-shouldered man emerged from the shelter. His face was weathered, his beard streaked with grey, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He wore layers that Jack now recognized as the standard hobo winter gear, but with refinements he hadn't seen before. "Whiskey Joe!" the man called out. "Thought you were headed to Denver." "Change of plans," Joe replied. "Got caught in that blizzard. These boys saved my hide." The man turned his attention to Pete and Jack, assessing them with experienced eyes. "Newspaper Pete," he said, recognition dawning. "Been a while." "Too long, Bill," Pete replied, the two men clasping hands firmly. "And who's the greenhorn?" Bill asked, nodding toward Jack. "Jack Morgan. Found him freezing in a boxcar out of Chicago. Been teaching him the newspaper method." Bill looked Jack over appraisingly. "He's still alive, so you must have taught him right." He gestured toward his shelter. "Come on in. Got a stove going." The interior of Bill's shelter was a revelation. Built partially underground, it used the Earth's insulation properties to maintain a temperature that, while not warm by normal standards, felt positively tropical after the bitter cold outside. A small iron stove in the centre provided heat, its chimney carefully routed through a complex system of metal tubes that extracted maximum warmth before the smoke exited. The walls were a patchwork of materials, wooden planks, canvas, metal sheets, all arranged in overlapping layers with visible air gaps between them. Triple wall insulation system, Bill explained, seeing Jack's interest. Outer layer blocks wind, middle layer traps dead air, inner layer reflects heat back in. The floor was elevated on pallets, creating an air gap between it and the frozen ground. Every detail had been considered, every material used to maximum effect. Most folks just try to find shelter, Bill continued. Smart ones build it instead. He gestured for them to sit on wooden crates arranged around the stove. From a pot simmering on top, he ladled a steaming liquid into tin cups. Rabbit stew. Got lucky with the traps yesterday. The hot food was the best thing Jack had tasted in days, warming him from the inside out. As they ate, Pete explained their journey and Jack's quick education in winter survival. Kids are natural, Pete concluded. Picked up the newspaper method in one night. Bill nodded appreciatively. Good. Always need more who know the ways. Too many freeze their first winter. When they'd finished eating, Pete broached the real purpose of their visit. Bill, I'm still looking for my son, Thomas Gardner. Been riding 3 years trying to find him. Bill's expression grew serious. Yeah, you mentioned him last time through. Dark hair, scar on his right cheek. Pete nodded eagerly. You've seen him. Not personally, but about 4 months back had a rider come through who mentioned meeting someone by that description in St. Louis. Said the kid was asking about you. Pete's face lit up with the first genuine hope Jack had seen. St. Louis? Recently? Well, summertime. Kid was headed west, Ryder thought, following the Union Pacific. Pete absorbed this information, clearly calculating routes and timetables in his head. That's the first solid lead I've had in years, he said softly. Bill nodded sympathetically. Rails are a big place, easy to miss someone even if you're looking for each other. We need to get to St. Louis, Pete said firmly. Not in winter, you don't, Bill countered. St. Louis route's dangerous this time of year. Mountain passes drift over, trains get stranded for weeks. Pete's face fell. But, Bill continued, come spring thaw, I can arrange guides for you. Men who know that route like the back of their hand. Spring's months away, Pete protested. And your boy's survived 3 winters on the rails already, Bill pointed out. Means he's learned the ways. Smart money says he's holed up somewhere safe for winter just like we are. Pete couldn't argue with that logic, though his frustration was evident. Meanwhile, Bill added, I'll put the word out. Got riders leaving for different jungles tomorrow. Have them ask about Thomas. I'd appreciate that, Pete said sincerely. Bill turned to Jack. How about you, Greenhorn? You sticking with Pete or got your own destination? Jack hadn't thought that far ahead. His only plan when jumping that first freight had been to get away from Chicago and the memories it held. Thought I might head west eventually, Jack said. Find work in California, maybe. California's crawling with men looking for work, Bill said bluntly. Not saying don't go, just saying don't expect it to be easier there. Jack nodded, absorbing this reality check. For now, he said, I'm sticking with Pete. Man saved my life. Least I can do is help him find his son. Pete looked at him with surprise, then gratitude. Well, you're both welcome here until the worst of winter passes, Bill offered. Got space in the common shelter, only rules. Contribute what you can, share what you know, respect the camp. Seems fair, Pete agreed. Perfect, Bill said, rising. Now, while there's still daylight, let me show you my shelter construction system. Makes Pete's corner setup look like a child's blanket fort. Pete laughed. That's why we came. Man never passes up a chance to show off his engineering skills. As they exited the shelter into the fading afternoon light, Jack realized he'd found something he hadn't expected on these frozen rails. A community bonded not by place or background, but by shared knowledge and the simple determination to survive. Bill led them through the camp, pointing out the various shelter designs and explaining the principles behind each. His expertise was obvious, his understanding of materials and weather profound. In newspaper, Pete knows body insulation better than anyone, Bill acknowledged. But shelter's where I shine. Together we've probably saved more lives than most doctors. Jack absorbed every word, every technique. He'd entered this world by desperation, but he was beginning to see that survival here required more than luck. It required knowledge, discipline, and a willingness to learn from those who'd mastered the harsh realities of life on the winter rails. The next morning, Jack woke to unfamiliar sounds. Voices, laughter, the clank of metal pots. After days in the isolated boxcar with only Pete for company, the bustle of Bill's jungle was jarring. He sat up on his pallet in the common shelter, a long structure that housed about 20 men. The shelter design was another of Bill's masterpieces, partially sunken into the ground with a ceiling made of salvaged doors layered with earth for insulation. Small ventilation holes kept the air breathable without letting heat escape, and sleeping pallets were raised off the ground on platforms of scavenged lumber. Pete was already up, his space neatly arranged. Jack had noticed that about him. Despite living as a hobo, Pete maintained a carpenter's precision in everything he did. "Morning, kid," Pete greeted him. "Sleep well?" Jack nodded. After the bone-chilling nights on the train, the merely cold temperature of the shelter had felt luxurious. "Come on, got kitchen duty this morning. Our contribution to camp." They made their way to the central cooking area, where several men were already working over fires built in sunken pits protected from the wind by strategically placed walls of packed snow and scrap wood. "Bill runs this place like a military operation," Pete explained as they walked. "Everyone contributes according to their skills. Can't cook? You chop wood. Can't chop wood? You repair shelters. Can't build. You stand watch. Watch for what? Bulls, mostly. Camp like this, organised and permanent, railroad security would love to clear it out. Also, locals looking for trouble. Hard times bring out the worst in some folks. At the cooking area, they were put to work by a thin man with a handlebar moustache who introduced himself as Chef, though Jack doubted that was his real name. "You're on potato detail," Chef informed them, pointing to a sack of wrinkled potatoes. These were rescued from a produce car last week, bit frozen but still good. For the next hour, Jack and Pete peeled and chopped potatoes for the morning stew. Around them, the camp came fully to life as men emerged from various shelters to begin their daily tasks. Jack was struck by the diversity of the group. There were former businessmen like himself, skilled labourers like Pete, veterans of the Great War, farmers who'd lost their land, and young men who'd never had the chance to establish themselves before the crash hit. "How many people stay here?" Jack asked as they worked. "Varies," Pete replied. "Core group of about 30 year-round. In winter can swell to 80 or more as riders hole up to avoid the worst cold. Bill never turns anyone away, but he insists they learn the ways and contribute. How does he feed everyone? Combination of foraging, trapping, midnight shopping from railroad cars, and charity from sympathetic locals." Pete lowered his voice. "Bill's got an arrangement with a couple of grocers in town. They set aside damaged goods that would get thrown out anyway." Camp sends men in rotation to collect it after hours. Jack nodded, understanding the delicate balance between theft and survival. In the Depression's fourth harsh winter, such distinctions had blurred for many. Their potato duty complete, Chef assigned them to water collection. This involved taking clean snow from designated collection points and melting it in large metal tubs positioned near the cooking fires. Snow collection has strict rules, Pete explained as they worked. Only take from marked areas. No yellow snow, obviously. No snow that might have chimney soot or other contaminants. Water's as important as shelter out here. As they finished filling the water barrels, a commotion at the edge of camp caught their attention. 3 men were supporting a 4th who appeared unable to walk on his own. "Frostbite," Pete muttered, immediately moving toward the group. Jack followed, watching as the injured man was carried to a shelter near Bill's headquarters that Pete identified as the camp infirmary. "Dr. Carl," someone shouted, "got a bad one." A thin, elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses emerged from a nearby shelter. Despite his age, he moved with purpose, directing the carriers to bring the injured man inside the infirmary. Pete and Jack joined the small crowd that had gathered outside. "What happened?" Pete asked a man standing next to them. Grover's group was hunting. Eddie here got separated in a whiteout, spent the night in a makeshift shelter, but it wasn't enough. By the time they found him this morning, his feet were already turning black. Jack felt sick. He'd heard about frostbite, but had never seen its effects firsthand. After a tense wait, Dr. Carl emerged from the infirmary. His expression was grim. "Both feet are severely frostbitten," he announced to the gathered men. "The right one, I'll have to amputate below the ankle. Left one might be saved if we're lucky." A murmur ran through the crowd. Everyone understood what this meant for a hobo. The end of independent travel, likely a life of begging if he survived at all. "Need volunteers," Dr. Carl continued. 2 to assist with the procedure, 3 to search for medicine. Pete immediately stepped forward. "I've assisted with field surgeries before, during the war." The doctor nodded gratefully. "Good, you're with me." 2 others volunteered to go to town to search for medical supplies, alcohol, clean bandages, and if possible, actual medicines from sympathetic doctors or pharmacists. "What can I do?" Jack asked, feeling helpless. "Kitchen duty just became all day," Pete told him. "These men will need hot food when they return, and after surgery, Eddie will need broth and soft foods. It's not glory work, but it matters." Jack nodded, accepting the assignment. As the crowd dispersed to their various tasks, the crisis response impressed him. There was no panic, no confusion, just immediate, coordinated action. Back at the cooking area, Jack found Chef already reorganizing the day's meal plan. "We'll need more broth now," Chef said without preamble. "Start another pot. Use those chicken bones from yesterday and whatever vegetables we've got left." Jack worked alongside 3 other men, all focused on their tasks. No one talked much, but there was a sense of shared purpose. They weren't just cooking, they were contributing to the camp's survival mechanism. As the day progressed, Jack learned more about the jungle's food systems from Chef, who turned out to be a former restaurant owner from Philadelphia. "Winter food's all about preservation and prevention," Chef explained as they worked. "Prevent freezing when possible, preserve what you can't keep fresh, and always, always have emergency rations that can be eaten frozen if necessary." He showed Jack the camp's food storage systems, root vegetables buried in straw-lined pits dug into the ground below the frost line, meat preserved by smoking or drying, flour and grains stored in sealed metal containers to keep out moisture and vermin. Most important lesson, Shitsall: nature main bin me is portion control. Rather 10 small meals than one big one that runs out. Predictable hunger is manageable. Unexpected starvation kills. By late afternoon, the search party had returned with precious medical supplies, some donated, some liberated from less secure sources. They rushed these to the infirmary where Pete and Dr. Carl were still working. It was after dark when Pete finally emerged, looking exhausted. Jack handed him a tin cup of hot stew. "How is he?" Jack asked. Pete sighed heavily. "Lost the right foot, left one still touch and go. Next 48 hours will tell." "Will he survive?" "Body-wise, probably. Dr. Carl knows his stuff." "Spirit-wise?" Pete shrugged. "That's up to him. Some men give up when they lose their mobility. Others adapt." Pete took a long drink of his stew before continuing. Eddie kept saying he should have known better. He's an experienced winter rider. But one mistake, one small error in judgment during the whiteout, and now he's paying with his foot. The harsh reality of their existence hung in the air between them. On the winter rails, there was no margin for error, no forgiveness for momentary lapses. They ate in silence for a while, the gravity of Eddie's situation weighing on them both. Around them, the camp continued its evening routines, men gathering around fires, sharing stories, maintaining equipment, preparing for another cold night. "Bill wants to see us," Pete said finally, "after we eat. Says he's got news." They found Bill in his headquarters, poring over what looked like hand-drawn maps spread across a makeshift table. The stove was burning low, casting long shadows across the earthen walls. "There you are," Bill greeted them. "Heard you did good work today, Pete. Dr. Carl says he couldn't have managed without you." Pete shrugged off the praise. "Just did what needed doing." "That's the attitude that keeps men alive out here." Bill gestured for them to sit. "Got word from some riders who came in from the east. Thought you'd want to hear it." Pete leaned forward eagerly. "About Thomas?" Bill nodded. "Maybe. Rider named Slim Jim came in with a group from Omaha. Says he met a young man matching Thomas's description in a jungle outside Kansas City about 2 months ago." "What was he doing there?" Pete asked, hope evident in his voice. "According to Slim, asking about you. Said he'd heard his father was riding the rails teaching the newspaper insulation method, was trying to track you down." Pete's hands trembled slightly. "Did Slim tell him where I might be?" "Didn't know at the time. But here's the interesting part. The young man mentioned heading for the big St. Louis jungle for winter. Said a lot of riders congregate there. Might have better luck finding information." "That matches what we heard yesterday," Pete said excitedly. "He's in St. Louis." Bill held up a cautioning hand. "Maybe. Information's 2 months old, but it's a solid lead." "When can we leave?" Pete asked, already half rising from his seat. "Not so fast," Bill countered. "St. Louis route's still blocked by snow. Try now, you'll end up stranded or worse." Pete sank back down, frustration written across his face. "But," Bill continued, "I've been studying the weather patterns. Warm fronts moving in from the south. If it holds, passes might clear in as little as 2 weeks." 2 weeks? Pete repeated, clearly thinking this was still too long. 2 weeks where you're safe, with shelter and food, Bill pointed out. 2 weeks to prepare properly. 2 weeks for me to arrange guides who know the route. He fixed Pete with a stern look. 2 weeks that could mean the difference between finding your son and dying in a drift, trying to reach him. The logic was undeniable, even to Pete in his eager state. "Besides," Bill added more gently, "if he's in St. Louis, he's in one of the best winter jungles on the rails. Man named Iron Mike runs it, built into the side of a bluff near the river. Natural cave systems expanded over years. Safest place to winter east of the Mississippi." Pete nodded, accepting the wisdom even as impatience gnawed at him. "What can we do while we wait?" "Learn," Bill said simply. "Everything I can teach you, my shelter systems are more advanced than what you've been using, could save your lives on the journey." He turned to Jack. "And you, Greenhorn, Pete's taught you the basics, but there's more to winter survival than newspaper insulation and corner shelters." "I'm ready to learn whatever you can teach," Jack replied sincerely. "Good, because starting tomorrow, you're both on the advanced course." Bill's eyes twinkled with a hint of mischief. "Hope you like early mornings." Bill wasn't joking about early mornings. Before dawn the next day, he roused them from their pallets and led them to a clearing at the edge of the jungle. "First lesson," he announced, breath clouding in the pre-dawn chill. "Emergency shelter construction using snow only. No tools, no scavenged materials." For the next hour, as the eastern sky slowly brightened, Bill taught them how to create a snow shelter by packing snow into a mound, allowing it to set, then hollowing out the interior. "Snow's a better insulator than most people realize," Bill explained as they worked. "Trapped air between snowflakes creates dead space that holds heat. Same principle as newspaper layers, just natural." The completed shelter was surprisingly effective. Despite the temperature hovering around 10 below zero, the interior of the snow structure was noticeably warmer than outside. "In truly desperate situations, this can keep you alive overnight," Bill concluded. "Not comfortable, not ideal, but survivable." From there, they moved on to more complex shelter systems using minimal materials, a tarp and rope shelter that maximized coverage with minimal fabric, a brush shelter that utilized fallen branches and natural materials, and Bill's specialty, the hybrid shelter that combined multiple techniques for maximum effectiveness. "Most folks think in terms of single-method shelters," Bill explained, "but the best protection comes from combining approaches: snow base for insulation, brush walls for structure, canvas or tarp top for wind and moisture protection." Each lesson was hands-on, with Bill insisting they build functional examples of every shelter type. By midday, Jack's muscles ached from the unaccustomed labor, but his mind was buzzing with new knowledge. After a quick meal, Bill shifted focus to another critical survival skill: firemaking in extreme conditions. 3 challenges to winter fires, Bill lectured as they gathered materials: finding dry fuel, getting it started in the wind, and maintaining it efficiently. He showed them how to locate and identify truly dry wood, even in snow-covered forests, how to create windbreaks that protected delicate starting flames, and how to arrange fuel for maximum heat with minimum consumption. "Fire's your friend, but a demanding one," Bill concluded. "Feed it right, protect it well, it'll keep you alive. Get careless, it'll go out when you need it most or burn your shelter down around you." The lessons continued for days, each morning bringing new skills to master. Jack threw himself into the learning with unexpected enthusiasm. These weren't abstract concepts or theoretical knowledge. They were immediate practical skills with clear survival value. Pete, despite his eagerness to resume the search for his son, was equally engaged. He already knew many of the techniques from his years on the rails, but Bill's refinements and systematic approach impressed even him. "Man's a genius," Pete admitted privately to Jack after a particularly challenging lesson on creating water collection systems from snow. "Been riding 3 years and still learning from him." Throughout these intensive training sessions, life in the jungle continued around them. Eddie, the man who'd lost his foot to frostbite, was recovering in the infirmary under Dr. Carl's care. The regular rhythm of camp chores, cooking, water collection, wood gathering, shelter maintenance, provided structure to the days. Jack found himself integrating into the community with surprising ease. Despite their diverse backgrounds, the men shared a common language of survival and a code of mutual support that transcended their differences. Former bankers worked alongside former farmhands. College-educated men took direction from those who'd never finished grade school but knew the ways of the rails. One evening, about a week into their training, Jack sat with Pete by one of the common fires. Around them, men were engaged in the nightly rituals of equipment repair and storytelling. "I never expected this," Jack admitted quietly. "Expected what?" Pete asked. "This community. When I jumped that freight out of Chicago, I thought I was leaving everything behind. Family, friends, society itself." Jack gestured at the activity around them. "Never thought I'd find another kind of society out here." Pete nodded thoughtfully. "Most folks have the wrong idea about riding the rails. Think it's all lone wolves and every man for himself." He looked around the camp. "Sure, there's some like that, but they're usually the ones found frozen come spring thaw." "Is that why you teach others? To build this kind of community?" "Partly," Pete acknowledged. "But mostly because that's what Henry taught me. Pass on what you know. Knowledge shared is lives saved." Jack thought about his own journey, from desperate, freezing newcomer to student of the winter ways. In just over a week, he'd gained skills that would have taken years to develop on his own if he'd survived at all. "When we find your son," Jack said, the question of if no longer in his vocabulary. "What then?" Pete was silent for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "Haven't thought that far ahead. Find him first. Rest will sort itself out. You ever think about going back to your wife in California?" Pete's expression grew distant. "Every day. But the man she married owned a business, built houses, provided for his family." He looked down at his weathered hands. "That man's gone. Don't know if she'd recognize who I've become." "Seems to me you've become someone worth recognizing," Jack said quietly. "Someone who saves lives and teaches others to survive. There's honor in that." Pete didn't respond, but something in his expression shifted, a softening around the eyes perhaps, or a slight easing of the permanent tension in his shoulders. Around them, the fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky. The temperature was dropping as darkness deepened. But inside the perimeter of Bill's jungle, they were as safe as anyone could be in the frozen heart of a depression winter. The promised warm front arrived faster than expected. 10 days after their arrival at Bill's jungle, the temperature climbed to a balmy 20 degrees above zero, practically tropical by winter rail standards. "Snow's melting in the passes," Bill announced during the morning meal. "St. Louis route should be clear in another day or two." Pete couldn't hide his excitement. After years of searching, he was closer than ever to finding Thomas. "We'll leave tomorrow," he decided, looking to Jack for confirmation. "First light." Jack nodded. Though the idea of leaving the relative safety of the jungle was daunting, he'd made a promise to help Pete find his son. "You'll need better gear," Bill said matter-of-factly. "Corner shelters and newspaper layers are good for emergencies, but for a journey this long in winter conditions, you need specialized equipment." He led them to a storage shelter at the edge of camp, a low structure almost invisible against the snow-covered ground. Inside, Bill had organized a surprising collection of salvaged materials, sorted by type and potential use. "Community resources," Bill explained. "Everyone contributes what they can, takes only what they need." From this treasure trove, Bill helped them assemble enhanced survival kits. He upgraded Pete's waterproof newspaper bag with a more robust oilcloth design that could hold twice as much. He showed Jack how to make a specialized tool for opening frozen boxcar doors. Both received improved insulation systems that built on Pete's newspaper method but incorporated additional materials for better durability. The newspaper core is still the foundation, Bill explained, but these outer layers of canvas and wool will protect it better during extended travel. Less maintenance, more reliability. As they worked on their gear, a commotion at the camp entrance caught their attention. A group of 4 people had arrived, 3 men and, surprisingly, a woman. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete muttered. "That's Survival Sally. Ain't seen her since Nebraska last winter." Jack watched with interest as the newcomers were welcomed into camp. The woman stood out not just because of her gender, but because of her obvious competence. She moved with the confident ease of someone thoroughly at home in this harsh environment. Bill greeted her with evident respect. "Sally, thought you were wintering in Colorado this year." "Change of plans," she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the camp. "Heard you had the best setup east of the Rockies. Figured I'd see for myself." As the newcomers were shown to available shelters, Pete filled Jack in on Sally's reputation. One of the few women who's mastered winter train travel, got food preservation techniques that'll keep you fed when everything else fails, survived 3 days in a blizzard that killed 2 men traveling with her. Later that afternoon, as Jack was collecting wood near the edge of camp, Sally approached him. "You're the banker from Chicago, right?" she asked without preamble. Jack was startled. "How'd you know?" Sally smiled, a quick flash of humour in an otherwise serious face. "News travels on the rails. Pete's been telling everyone he found a city boy freezing to death and turned him into a winter rider." She extended a gloved hand. "Sally Winters, though most folks call me Survival Sally." Jack shook her hand, noting her firm grip. "Jack Morgan, and yeah, Pete saved my life, taught me the newspaper insulation method." "Pete's good with that," Sally acknowledged, "but if you're heading to St. Louis tomorrow, you'll need more than newspaper to keep you alive, especially for food and water." "Bill's been teaching us some techniques," Jack offered. "Bill knows shelters better than anyone, but food," Sally shook her head, "that's my specialty, and you boys will need every trick there is to make it to St. Louis without starving." Before Jack could respond, Sally had turned and walked away, calling over her shoulder, "My shelter! 1 hour! Bring Pete!" Jack reported this encounter to Pete, who seemed pleased. Perfect timing. Sally's forgotten more about winter food strategies than most folks will ever learn. An hour later, they found Sally at her shelter, which she'd already modified with several additions that Jack didn't recognize. "Ventilated food storage," Sally explained, seeing his curiosity, "keeps provisions from freezing solid but still cold enough to prevent spoilage." Inside, Sally had arranged an impressive array of food items, each prepared and stored in specific ways. "Food selection system," she began without preliminary small talk. "Winter riding needs specific types of food. High-fat items stay edible when frozen. Bacon, lard, nuts, critical for maintaining body heat." She showed them how she prepared each item, cutting bacon into small, bite-sized pieces, grinding nuts into coarse meal, slicing dried meat into thin strips that could be softened with body heat. "Never carry food that requires cooking," she warned. "Fire's a luxury, not guarantee. Everything must be edible, cold, or frozen." Pete nodded along, occasionally adding his own observations. Jack took mental notes, recognizing the life-saving value of this knowledge. "Water management's even trickier," Sally continued, showing them her collection of small metal flasks. "Multiple containers rotated inside clothing to prevent freezing, never one large canteen." She demonstrated her emergency water technique, using a small metal cup held against the body to melt snow. Slow process, she admitted, but reliable when nothing else works. Just remember, only use clean snow from areas away from railroad tracks. Industrial pollution's no joke. The lesson continued for hours, covering food storage, emergency rations sewn into clothing, hunger management techniques, and even how to safely eat snow when desperate. Mental aspects matter too, Sally emphasized. Hunger clouds judgment. Small, regular amounts of sugar can provide quick energy boosts that improve mental clarity during critical decisions. By the time they finished, night had fallen. Sally insisted they stay for a meal that demonstrated her principles in action, a surprisingly satisfying combination of dried meat softened in melted snow, nut paste mixed with dried berries, and small pieces of hard cheese. Travel rations, she explained as they ate, can sustain you for days without cooking or preparation. As they were leaving, Sally handed each of them a small cloth bundle. Emergency food cache. Sew it into your coat lining. Contains enough calories to keep you alive for 48 hours if you lose everything else. Thank you, Jack said sincerely, for the food and the knowledge. Sally's expression remained serious. Don't thank me, just survive. Too many don't make it through their first winter. Pete nodded in understanding. We'll make it to St. Louis. Got too much riding on this journey to fail. Thomas, right? Sally asked quietly. Still looking for your boy? Pete's face showed surprise. You've heard about him. Rails have ears, Pete. Everyone knows you're searching. She hesitated, then added, heard a rumour last fall. Young man in St. Louis asking about a carpenter-turned-hobo who teaches the newspaper method. Could have been him. Hope flared in Pete's eyes. That's what we've heard too. Heading there tomorrow. Good luck, Sally said simply. If anyone can make that journey in winter, it's you. Morning brought chaos to the typically ordered camp. A rider had arrived before dawn with alarming news. Railroad bulls were conducting sweeps of all known jungles in the area. Someone must have talked, Bill growled as he organized the camp's response. Bulls usually leave us alone in winter unless they're tipped off. The camp mobilized with practiced efficiency. Valuable supplies were hidden in underground caches. Shelters were partially dismantled to make them look abandoned. Fires were extinguished and covered with snow to hide evidence of recent use. What's the plan? Jack asked Pete as they quickly packed their newly assembled gear. We stick to our schedule, Pete replied firmly. Leave for St. Louis today. Bulls coming just means we go sooner rather than later. Bill approached them, his expression grim. Train spotters report freight heading east in 2 hours. We'll slow for the junction curve 5 miles south. Your best chance to board. We'll take it, Pete decided. Rather face the rails than bulls any day. Bill handed them each a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Extra newspapers, dried meat and matches. Not much, but might make the difference. Thanks for everything, Bill, Pete said, clasping the man's hand. Hope we meet again under better circumstances. Find your boy, Bill replied simply. That's thanks enough. Sally appeared, carrying what looked like additional food bundles. Extra rations, she explained, handing them over. Journey to St. Louis takes 3 days in good conditions. Allow for 5. Jack was touched by the community's generosity, especially when resources were so precious. We should go, Pete urged, looking nervously at the sun climbing higher. Need to reach the junction before the train. They said hasty goodbyes to those who had become friends in such a short time. Eddie, now recovering on crutches, insisted on giving Jack a small knife he'd carved from railroad spike steel. Saved my life more than once, he explained. Maybe it'll do the same for you. The exodus from camp had begun, with riders heading in different directions to avoid creating an obvious trail. Bill's jungle would temporarily disperse, then regroup once the danger had passed, a drill they'd clearly practiced before. Pete and Jack headed south, trudging through snow that had begun to develop a thin crust as temperatures hovered around freezing. The warmer weather was a mixed blessing, easier on their bodies but creating slush that soaked through to their feet if they weren't careful. "Keep your boots dry," Pete reminded Jack as they walked. "Wet feet in winter will kill you faster than hunger." They made good time, reaching a ridge that overlooked the junction by mid-morning. From their vantage point, they could see railroad tracks stretching east and west, converging at a switch point near a water tower. "Perfect spot," Pete assessed. "Train will slow to about 15 miles per hour for that curve. Manageable jumping speed." They settled in to wait, using the time to check their insulation layers and secure their packs. Jack realized how much he'd learned in the short time since leaving Chicago. His hands now moved with practiced efficiency as he adjusted his newspaper wrappings and checked his food supplies. "You're not the same greenhorn who nearly froze to death in that boxcar," Pete observed, noting Jack's competence. "Had a good teacher," Jack replied with a small smile. "Several, actually." A distant whistle announced the approaching train. They moved closer to the tracks, positioning themselves behind a stand of trees to remain hidden until the last moment. "Remember the technique," Pete coached as the train came into view. "Wait for a good car. Boxcar with door partially open is ideal. Time your run to match the train's speed. Jump for the door handle. Pull yourself up and in. Never grab moving parts or wheels." Jack nodded, focusing on controlling his breathing. Despite his growing confidence, jumping a moving train still terrified him. The locomotive thundered past their hiding spot, belching smoke into the winter air. They counted cars, watching for suitable rides. "There!" Pete pointed to an empty boxcar with its door slid open about 2 feet. "That's our ride. Ready?" Jack nodded, though his dry mouth and pounding heart suggested otherwise. "Now!" Pete shouted, breaking from cover. They ran alongside the tracks, matching their pace to the slowing train. The boxcar approached, its open door tantalizingly close, yet still moving fast enough to kill if they mistimed their jump. Pete went first, grabbing the handle beside the door and swinging himself up with practiced grace. He immediately turned, extending a hand to Jack. Jack pumped his legs harder, reaching for Pete's outstretched hand. Their fingers touched, slipped, then connected firmly. With Pete's help, Jack hauled himself up and into the relative safety of the boxcar. They collapsed on the wooden floor, breathing hard from the exertion. "Made it!" Pete gasped, a grin splitting his weathered face. "First step to St. Louis." Jack nodded, unable to speak yet. The reality of what they were doing hit him anew. Riding a freight train in winter, pursuing a young man who might or might not be in St. Louis, facing dangers that had killed countless others attempting the same journey. "Having second thoughts?" Pete asked, reading Jack's expression. "No," Jack replied honestly. "Just respecting what we're up against." Pete nodded approvingly. "Healthy fear keeps you sharp. No fear makes you dead." They settled into the familiar routine of creating a secure space in the boxcar. Pete immediately began constructing one of Bill's improved corner shelters, while Jack organized their food supplies according to Sally's system. 3 to 5 days to St. Louis, Pete calculated as they worked, assuming no major delays or weather changes. Jack noticed Pete's hands trembling slightly as he tied knots in the shelter framework. Not from cold, he realized, but from emotion. After years of searching, Pete was potentially days away from finding his son. "We'll find him," Jack said with quiet confidence. Pete nodded, not trusting himself to speak. After a moment, he cleared his throat and said, "First rule of winter riding, never make promises about things you can't control." but Jack could see the hope burning behind Pete's gruff exterior. For a man who had lost everything, the possibility of reconnecting with his son represented more than just a family reunion. It was redemption, a chance to reclaim part of the life the depression had stolen from him. As the train picked up speed, heading east towards St. Louis, Jack found himself reflecting on his own journey. Just weeks ago, he had been a desperate, suicidal ex-banker with nothing to live for. Now he had purpose, skills, and something he hadn't expected to find on the frozen rails. Friendship. The countryside rolled by outside, transforming from the flat plains of Kansas to the gently rolling hills of Missouri. The temperature fluctuated as they traveled, sometimes dropping sharply when the sun disappeared behind clouds, then rising again when it emerged. "The weather's unstable," Pete observed, concern evident in his voice. "Warm fronts fighting with cold air could get messy." Jack understood the implications. Rapid temperature changes created dangerous conditions, freezing rain, ice storms, unpredictable wind patterns. Any of these could derail their carefully planned journey. By late afternoon, the train stopped at a small town for water and coal. They remained hidden in their boxcar, using the opportunity to check their insulation systems and make minor repairs to their shelter. "Bulls will check the yard," Pete whispered as they worked. "Stay quiet, stay out of sight." Sure enough, lantern lights soon appeared, moving systematically from car to car. They froze in their corner shelter, barely breathing as the lights swept briefly across their boxcar before moving on. "Close one," Jack muttered when the danger had passed. "Get used to it," Pete replied grimly. "More yards means more bulls. Route to St. Louis passes through plenty of towns." The train remained stopped longer than expected. As darkness fell, Pete grew increasingly restless. "Something's wrong," he muttered, peering through a crack in the boxcar door. "Shouldn't be stopped this long for just water and coal." Jack joined him at the door, but could see little in the gathering darkness. The small town's rail yard was poorly lit, with only a few lanterns marking key points. A sudden commotion drew their attention. Shouts, the sound of running feet, then a series of sharp whistle blasts. "Bulls found someone," Pete translated. 3 whistle blasts is their signal for rider-spotted pursue. They watched tensely as shadows moved through the yard, converging on a point near the caboose. A figure broke from the pursuit, running desperately toward the front of the train. "They're heading this way," Jack whispered. Pete made a quick decision. Close the shelter. No light, no sound. They retreated into their corner setup, pulling the canvas covering tight. Through small observation ports, they could just make out the dark shapes of men moving past their car. Suddenly, the boxcar door slid further open. A figure hurled itself inside, landing with a thud on the wooden floor. "They're in here," Jack hissed. "Wait," Pete cautioned, peering through the observation port. The figure was small, lying motionless where they had fallen. No pursuing bulls had yet reached their car. Pete made a snap judgment. "Cover me," he whispered, slipping out of the shelter. Jack watched anxiously as Pete crept toward the prone figure. Outside, voices called to each other as the search continued. Pete reached the person, bent down, then straightened in evident surprise. He quickly dragged the figure toward their shelter. "Help me," he urged Jack. "Quick, before they check this car." Together, they pulled the unconscious form into their shelter, sealing the entrance behind them just as lantern lights swept across the boxcar floor. In the dim light filtering through the canvas, Jack could now see that their unexpected guest was a boy, no more than 16 or 17, dressed in clothes inadequate for winter travel. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. Bulls must have caught him and roughed him up. Pete whispered, checking the boy's pulse. "He's alive, just knocked out." They waited in tense silence as the bulls conducted a cursory check of their car before moving on. Only when the lantern light had disappeared and the voices had faded did they relax slightly. "Is he hurt bad?" Jack asked, examining the unconscious youth. "Don't think so. Head wound superficial. More worried about cold exposure. These clothes wouldn't keep him alive overnight." As if on cue, the train whistle sounded and the boxcar lurched as they began moving again. "We're stuck with him now," Pete observed, not unkindly. "Can't put him back out there to freeze." Jack was already removing his outer layer. "We can share our insulation. Got plenty of newspaper." Pete nodded approvingly. "Start with his core temperature. Chest and torso first, then limbs." They worked efficiently, wrapping the unconscious boy in layers of newspaper secured with cloth strips, just as Pete had done for Jack on that first desperate night. "He's young," Jack observed as they worked. "Too young to be riding alone in winter." "Same could be said for a lot of folks out here," Pete replied. "Depression didn't check ID before destroying lives." The boy stirred as they finished wrapping his torso, his eyelids fluttering. "Easy there," Pete said softly. "You're safe for now." The boy's eyes opened fully, panic immediately filling them. He tried to sit up, to escape, but was too weak to manage it. "We're not bulls," Jack assured him quickly. "We're riders like you, found you unconscious after they roughed you up." Confusion replaced fear in the boy's eyes. Where am I?" "Freight car heading east," Pete answered. "I'm Newspaper Pete. This is Jack. And you're damn lucky to be alive, son." The boy relaxed slightly, recognizing Pete's name. "Newspaper Pete? The one who teaches the insulation method?" Pete nodded, surprise evident on his face. "You've heard of me?" "Everyone on the rails has heard of you," the boy replied, his voice gaining strength. "Been trying to find you, actually." A strange expression crossed Pete's face, hope mingled with disbelief. "What's your name, son?" he asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. The boy hesitated, and then replied, Thomas Gardner." The boxcar seemed to freeze around them, time suspended in the space between the boy's words and Pete's reaction. "Thomas," Pete whispered, his weathered face transformed by shock and desperate hope. "My Thomas." The boy stared at Pete, recognition slowly dawning in his eyes. "Dad, is that really you?" For a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic clacking of train wheels on frozen track. Pete stared at the boy as if afraid he might disappear if he blinked. "Thomas?" he whispered again, his voice cracking. "Is it really you?" The boy nodded slowly, his own eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad, how? I've been looking everywhere for you." Pete moved forward hesitantly, then all at once pulled his son into a fierce embrace. Thomas winced, his injuries from the bull's beating still fresh, but he returned the hug with equal intensity. Jack turned away, giving them privacy in this impossible moment. The odds against this reunion happening, father and son searching for each other across thousands of miles of rail lines through years of separation only to literally crash into each other in a random boxcar, were astronomical. When he looked back, Pete was wiping his eyes with a grimy hand while Thomas talked rapidly, words tumbling out as if he couldn't get them out fast enough. "Mum got your letters, the money you sent. She read them to me every time, said you were out there helping people survive. I wanted to help too. Wanted to find you." "Your mother let you leave?" Pete asked incredulously. "To ride the rails?" Thomas looked down. "Not exactly. Left a note. Said I'd be back with you or not at all." Pete's face darkened. 3 years, Thomas. You've been out here 3 years. You were just a boy. Still am, in some ways, Thomas admitted, but the rails grow you up fast. Pete couldn't seem to stop touching his son's face, his shoulders, as if confirming he was solid and real. "You're hurt," he said, noticing again the cut on Thomas's forehead. "And freezing. Your clothes are all wrong for winter riding." "Lost my pack running from the bulls," Thomas explained. "Had better gear, but they caught me trying to get water at the yard pump." "First things first," Pete said, shifting instantly into survival mode. "Let's finish getting you properly insulated, then food, water and rest. Questions and catching up can wait till you're stable." Jack watched with admiration as Pete set aside his overwhelming emotions to focus on his son's immediate needs. It was the winter rider's way. Emotions were luxury items. Survival necessities came first. They completed Thomas's newspaper insulation system, with Pete fussing over every detail like a mother hen. Jack melted clean snow in a small metal cup using his body heat, following Sally's technique perfectly. When the water was liquid, he added a pinch of dried meat powder from her rations, creating a broth that would warm Thomas from the inside. "Drink slowly," Pete instructed his son. "Small sips. Let your body adjust." Thomas obeyed, but his eyes never left his father's face. "Can't believe I finally found you," he murmured between sips. "You're half frozen and got beat up by bulls," Pete replied gruffly, though his eyes shone with emotion. "Not exactly the reunion I pictured." "Actually, it's exactly how I pictured finding you," Thomas said with a weak grin. "In trouble and needing the newspaper insulation method." Pete laughed, a sound Jack had rarely heard from him. "Smart ass. Got that from your mother." As Thomas warmed and his strength returned, he began sharing fragments of his 3-year journey. He'd left Sacramento in early 1930, working his way east through odd jobs and freight hopping. Along the way, he'd been learning to survive on the rails, picking up techniques from other riders. "First winter nearly killed me," Thomas admitted. "Got caught in Colorado without proper gear. Old-timer named Jackson saved me, showed me basic insulation with newspapers, said he'd learned it from a guy named Newspaper Pete." Thomas smiled at his father. "That's when I knew I was on the right track." "Jackson," Pete mused. "Big guy, missing 2 fingers on his left hand?" Thomas nodded, surprised. "You know him?" "Taught him the method in Wyoming, winter of 30. Good to know he passed it on." Jack marvelled at the connections that existed in this seemingly chaotic world of rail riders, knowledge passed from person to person, creating an invisible network of survival expertise. "Second winter was better," Thomas continued. "Made it to Chicago, then south to avoid the worst cold. Kept asking about you everywhere. Lots of people had heard of Newspaper Pete, but always just missed you, or he was heading west when I was heading east." "Been doing the same," Pete said softly. "Looking for you, following rumours, always a step behind." "How'd you end up on this train?" Jack asked, curious about the extraordinary coincidence. Thomas grimaced. "Was wintering in a jungle outside Kansas City. Heard rumours of Newspaper Pete heading to Junction City. Got there 2 days ago, but the camp was abandoned. Railroad Bull told me, after roughing me up a bit, that they'd cleared the place out. Said riders scattered in all directions." "Bill's Jungle," Pete confirmed. "We just left there this morning." "Missed you by hours," Thomas said, shaking his head at the near miss. "Caught this freight hoping it might take me somewhere I could pick up your trail again." Pete explained their own journey and destination, St. Louis, where they'd heard Thomas might be. "We've been crossing paths for 3 years, Pete concluded, wonder in his voice. "Like 2 trains on parallel tracks, never quite meeting. Until now," Thomas said, gripping his father's hand. Jack checked the weather through the observation port, giving them another moment of privacy. The stars had vanished, obscured by gathering clouds. The temperature was dropping again. He could feel it in the air, seeping through cracks in the boxcar. "Weather's turning," he reported. "Warm fronts losing to the cold." Pete nodded, instantly shifting back to practical matters. "Thomas, how's your insulation holding? Any cold spots?" Thomas assessed his newspaper wrappings with practiced movements. "Seems good. Not my first time with the newspaper method, though yours is better than what Jackson taught me." "Show me your technique," Pete requested. "Want to see what you've learned." Thomas demonstrated his version of the newspaper insulation method. It was functional but missing key refinements. The overlapping pattern wasn't as efficient, and the securing technique allowed for gaps where cold air could penetrate. "Not bad," Pete assessed honestly. "Would keep you alive in moderate cold, but for extreme conditions you need the proper overlap pattern, like this." He showed his son the correct technique, with Jack adding pointers he'd learned from Pete and Bill. Thomas absorbed the lessons eagerly, his hands quickly gaining the muscle memory needed. "You're a natural," Pete said proudly. "Carpenter's hands." Thomas smiled at the compliment. "Used to help you in the workshop, remember, before everything went bad." A shadow crossed Pete's face. "I remember building that cabinet for Mrs. Hollister. You were sanding the doors." "Mum kept your tools," Thomas said softly. "Said you'd need them when you came home?" Pete looked away, emotion threatening to overwhelm him again. Jack busied himself checking their shelter, giving Pete time to compose himself. The train continued eastward through the night, its rhythm changing as they crossed into more hilly terrain. The temperature continued to drop, and snow began falling again, light at first, then heavier. "Storm coming," Pete assessed, watching the snowflakes swirl past their observation port. "Big one, from the feel of the pressure drop." Thomas nodded in agreement. "Barometer's falling fast, can tell by the pain in my old brake." He flexed his left arm. "Broke it falling off a train my first month out. Never set right." Pete winced at this evidence of hardship his son had endured in his absence. "Let me check our shelter. If a big storm's coming, we need to reinforce everything." They worked together to strengthen their corner setup, applying techniques Bill had taught them. Jack was impressed by Thomas's quick learning and adaptability. Despite his youth, he moved with the confidence of someone who had faced deadly conditions and survived. "What's our food situation?" Thomas asked as they worked. "Better than it could be," Jack replied, showing him Sally's carefully packed rations. "We've got high-fat foods that won't freeze, solid dried meat, nut meal, and emergency caches sewn into our coats." Thomas whistled appreciatively. "That's professional-level preparation. Who taught you that?" "Woman named Survival Sally," Pete answered. "Met her just before we left Junction City. Best food strategist on the rails." Thomas's eyes widened. "Survival Sally? She's a legend. Heard she survived 3 days in a Nebraska blizzard that killed 2 men with her." "That's her," Pete confirmed with a small smile, though she never mentions that story herself. As the night deepened, the storm intensified. Snow driven by powerful winds found every crack in the boxcar, sifting in to form small drifts on the wooden floor. The temperature plummeted further, turning their breath into frozen clouds that crystallized on their newspaper wrappings. "This is bad," Jack observed, checking the increasingly thick snow accumulation outside their observation port. "Train's slowing." "Drifts on the tracks," Pete explained grimly. "If they get too deep, we'll stop completely." The implications hung in the air between them. A train stranded in the wilderness during a major winter storm could mean death for unprepared riders. Thomas broke the tense silence. "If we get stranded, what's the plan?" Pete looked at his son approvingly. Good question. Always have a backup plan in winter. He considered for a moment. If the train stops more than 2 hours, we assess our position. If we're near a town, we might risk moving toward it. If not, we implement stationary survival protocol. What's that? Jack asked. Shelter in place, Pete explained. Reinforce insulation, establish a rotation for body heat sharing, minimize food and water consumption, and wait it out. How long can we last? Thomas wondered. With what we have, 3, maybe 4 days if we're careful, Pete calculated. Sally's rations plus our emergency caches would stretch that far. The train continued to slow, finally coming to a complete stop. The sudden silence was eerie after hours of constant movement. Now we wait, Pete said, checking his pocket watch. Mark the time. 2 hours, then we decide. They huddled in their shelter, each lost in thought. Jack found himself wondering about the engineer and crew. Were they warm in the locomotive, or struggling with their own battle against the elements? Thomas broke the silence with an unexpected question. Jack, how'd you meet my father? Jack glanced at Pete, who nodded for him to tell the story. Nearly froze to death in a boxcar out of Chicago, Jack admitted. First time riding in winter, had no idea what I was doing. Your father found me, taught me the newspaper method, probably saved my life. Sounds like him, Thomas said with evident pride. Always helping others. Just passing on what I learned, Pete demurred. Same as any winter rider would. Thomas shook his head. Not the same. Asked around about you for 3 years. Everyone knows Newspaper Pete, the man who teaches others to survive when no one else would bother. Pete looked uncomfortable with the praise. Enough about me. Tell us how you've been surviving. What techniques you've picked up. Thomas eagerly shared his accumulated knowledge, a snow shelter method he'd learned from a former Arctic explorer in Montana, a fire-starting technique using steel wool and batteries that worked in damp conditions, a signaling system using mirrors that could alert distant riders to danger or opportunity. Jack listened, fascinated by how this boy, still in his teens, had compiled survival wisdom from across the country. The hobo education system might be informal and haphazard, but it was undeniably effective. What about your mum? Pete finally asked, the question he'd clearly been holding back. How was Alice when you left? Thomas's expression grew serious. Working at a cannery in Sacramento, hours were long, pay was bad, but she kept a roof over our heads. He hesitated. She never stopped believing you'd come back. Kept your picture by her bed. Pete stared at his hands. Should have gone to her right away. Pride got in the way. Thought I needed to rebuild something first. Have something to offer. She didn't want something, Thomas said quietly. She wanted you. The truth of this simple statement hung in the air between them. Outside, the storm howled with increasing fury, rattling the boxcar with powerful gusts. Snow continued to find its way inside, accumulating in corners and along the edges of their shelter. 2 hours, Pete announced, checking his watch again. Decision time. They carefully opened the observation port wider, trying to assess their location. Nothing was visible but swirling snow and darkness. Can't tell if we're near civilization, Jack observed. Could be miles from anywhere. Train crew might know, Thomas suggested. Could try to reach the locomotive. Pete shook his head. Too risky in this blizzard. Moving between cars in these conditions could be fatal. One slip, one moment of disorientation and you're lost in the storm. So we shelter in place? Jack asked. Pete nodded grimly. For now, implement the protocol. Thomas, help me reinforce the outer shelter wall. Jack, inventory all food and water. Establish strict rations. They worked methodically, each focused on their assigned tasks. Jack organized their combined supplies, calculating minimum sustainable portions. Thomas and Pete reinforced their shelter, adding extra newspaper insulation to the walls and securing all potential gaps. Now, the rotation system, Pete instructed when these tasks were complete. 3-person setup is actually ideal. 1 person sleeps in the middle, getting warmth from both sides. Rotate positions every 2 hours so everyone gets a turn in the warmest spot. Jack marveled at the efficiency of the system. Even in this life-threatening situation, there was a protocol, a method developed through hard experience and passed from rider to rider. "What about the other riders?" Thomas asked suddenly. "There must be others on this train. Some might not know how to survive a stranding." Pete and Jack exchanged glances. It was the same concern Jack had raised in Junction City when they found the family and Whiskey Joe. "Can't risk searching the whole train in this storm," Pete said reluctantly. "But we can check adjacent cars when the wind dies down a bit." A particularly violent gust shook the boxcar, as if nature itself was emphasizing the danger of venturing outside. "For now, we focus on ourselves," Pete decided. "Can't help others if we don't survive." It was harsh logic, but undeniably true. Jack had learned that winter survival sometimes required setting aside normal social considerations. The cold didn't care about good intentions. They settled into their first rotation, with Thomas in the middle position. Despite the dire circumstances, Jack could see the peace on Pete's face as he lay next to his son. After 3 years of searching, of near misses and false leads, father and son were together again. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying, the wind screaming around the boxcar like a living thing trying to find a way in. The temperature continued to drop until even inside their reinforced shelter, they could feel the brutal cold probing for weaknesses. "Coldest night I've experienced," Jack admitted during a rotation change, and that's saying something after the last few weeks. "Cold snap following the warm front," Pete explained. "Often happens this way. Warm air retreats, Arctic air rushes in, temperature can drop 30 degrees in a matter of hours." "How cold do you think it is?" Thomas asked, his breath forming ice crystals on his scarf. Pete considered. "Outside, probably 40 below, with the wind chill closer to 70 below." Jack tried to comprehend such cold. At those temperatures, exposed flesh would freeze in minutes. Even their carefully constructed shelter and insulation systems were being tested to their limits. "Will the train crew try to move soon?" Jack wondered. Pete shook his head. "Not until the storm passes. Too dangerous otherwise. Risk derailment if they can't see the track condition. So we wait," Thomas concluded. "We wait," Pete agreed, "and we survive. That's what winter riders do." As they rotated positions again, Jack found himself in the middle. Despite the deadly cold, just feet away, the combined body heat of 3 people in their insulated cocoon created a microclimate that was almost comfortable. His thoughts drifted to the strange journey that had brought him here. From desperation in Chicago to this moment of crisis shared with a man who had become a friend and a boy who had crossed a continent to find his father. The Depression had destroyed millions of lives, torn families apart, and driven people to extremes simply to survive. Yet in the midst of this national catastrophe, small miracles still occurred. A father and son reunited in a frozen boxcar, strangers becoming allies against the common enemy of winter. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to human suffering or joy. Inside their shelter, 3 people huddled together, sharing warmth, food, and the most precious resource of all on the winter rails, knowledge that kept death at bay for one more night. Morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the first grey light revealed the true severity of their situation. Jack peered through the observation port to find the boxcar nearly buried in snow on one side, with massive drifts piled against the steel walls. "Train's not going anywhere soon," he reported grimly. Pete nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than fearful. "Time to check on the neighbours. Storms let up just enough to risk moving between cars." Thomas immediately volunteered. "I'll go." "No," Pete said firmly. "You just got your insulation layers properly established. Jack and I will go. You maintain the shelter and prepare rations for whoever we might find." Thomas wanted to argue, but knew his father was right. His improvised gear wasn't as reliable as their professionally constructed systems. "Be careful," was all he said. Pete and Jack prepared methodically for the dangerous journey between cars. They added extra newspaper layers to their extremities and faces, leaving only narrow slits for their eyes. Pete fashioned a guide rope from cord in his pack. "Tie this around your waist," he instructed Jack. "I'll go first. If visibility drops to 0, we can still find our way back." The preparations complete, they cautiously opened the boxcar door wider. The wind immediately tried to rip it from their hands, sending a shower of snow into their shelter. "Stay close," Pete shouted over the wind. "Next car is about 15 feet ahead." They pushed out into the storm. The cold hit Jack like a physical blow, penetrating his layers with frightening speed. The wind tore at his face, the tiny exposed portion around his eyes immediately beginning to sting and go numb. Walking was nearly impossible. The snow reached mid-thigh in places, and the wind pushed against them with hurricane force. Pete forged ahead, one hand gripping the side of the train for guidance, the other holding the rope connected to Jack. It seemed to take an eternity to reach the next car. When they finally found its door, Pete had to use his metal tool to break through the ice that had sealed it shut. The door finally slid open with a groan of protesting metal. "Hello," Pete called into the darkness. "Anyone riding?" a weak voice answered from the far corner. "Help, please." Their eyes adjusting to the dimness, they made out two forms huddled together under what looked like a single tattered blanket. A man and woman, both young, both clearly in the advanced stages of hypothermia. "Jesus," Jack muttered, immediately moving toward them. "They're freezing to death." The couple were barely conscious, their lips blue, their movements sluggish. Their clothes were completely inadequate. Light jackets, no gloves, ordinary shoes, clearly not experienced riders. Newlyweds, the young man managed to stutter through chattering teeth. "Trying to reach her parents in Illinois. No money for train fare." "Save your strength," Pete instructed, already removing his outer layer. "We need to warm you up first. Talk later." They worked quickly, applying their emergency protocols. The most urgent need was core warming. They helped the couple out of their wet outer clothes and began wrapping them in dry newspaper layers. "Got to move fast," Pete explained as they worked. "Severe hypothermia can kill even after you're in shelter. Body temperature continues dropping unless actively reversed." The young woman was in worse shape than her husband. Her extremities were dangerously cold, her responses increasingly confused. Pete recognized the signs of advanced hypothermia. "We need to get them back to our shelter," he decided. "Body heat from 5 people will warm them faster than anything we can rig here." "Can they walk?" Jack asked doubtfully. "Have to try. Carrying them in this wind would be impossible." They got the couple to their feet, supporting them between their own bodies. The newspaper insulation they'd hastily applied was minimal, but would help prevent further heat loss during the short journey. "Just 15 feet, Pete encouraged as they prepared to venture back into the storm. 15 feet to warmth and safety. The return journey was even harder than the outbound trip. The couple could barely stay upright, and twice the young woman nearly collapsed. Only Pete's iron grip kept her moving forward. When they finally reached their boxcar, Thomas was waiting anxiously at the door. His eyes widened at the sight of the half-frozen couple, but he immediately helped pull them inside. "Get them in the shelter," Pete directed. "Center position. We need to warm them from both sides." They arranged the couple in the middle of their shelter, with Thomas and Jack on either side providing direct body heat. Pete worked quickly to prepare hot broth using Sally's technique of melting snow with body heat and adding dried meat powder. "Small sips," he instructed the young man, who was recovering faster than his wife. "Too much too fast can shock your system." The young woman remained barely responsive, her skin alarmingly pale, except for patches of red on her cheeks and nose, early signs of frostbite. "She needs more heat," Pete said with concern. "Jack, Thomas, press closer. Direct contact is best." They repositioned, creating a human cocoon around the shivering woman. Pete prepared a special mixture from Sally's supplies, a high-energy paste of nut meal, dried fruit, and a precious pinch of sugar. "Try to get her to take some," he told the husband. "Sugar will help her brain function, critical for recovery." For nearly an hour, they focused entirely on warming the couple. Gradually, colour returned to the woman's face, and her violent shivering subsided to occasional tremors. The man recovered enough to speak coherently. "Name's Robert," he introduced himself. "This is my wife, Emma. We got married last month in Kansas City, heading to her folks' farm near Springfield, Illinois." "First time riding?" Pete asked gently. Robert nodded, shame evident in his expression. "Thought it would be simple. Just hop a train, get off near her hometown. Didn't realize," he gestured at the storm outside. "Winter riding isn't something you figure out on your own," Pete said without judgment. "Knowledge is passed rider to rider. No shame in not knowing what no one taught you." Emma stirred, her eyes opening with more clarity. What happened?" "You're safe," her husband assured her. "These men found us. They know how to survive out here." Pete checked her extremities, relieved to find no serious frostbite. "You got lucky. Another hour in that cold with those clothes would have lost fingers and toes at minimum." "Thank you," Emma said weakly. "We would have died without you." "That's not how it works on the winter rails," Pete replied simply. "Knowledge gets shared, lives get saved. Someday you'll do the same for someone else." With the immediate crisis addressed, they reorganized their shelter to accommodate 5 people. Space was tight, but the additional body heat actually improved their overall situation. Pete adjusted their ration calculations, portioning their food to stretch for all 5 of them. "How long do you think we'll be stranded?" Robert asked as Pete handed out carefully measured portions of Sally's dried meat. "Depends on the storm," Pete replied honestly. "Could be hours, could be days. Railroad will send a plow eventually, but they prioritize passenger trains and important freight. This train's mostly empty boxcars heading east for loading. We're low priority." "What happens when the food runs out?" Emma asked, the fear returning to her voice. Thomas spoke up confidently. "Won't come to that. Between Sally's rations and our emergency caches, we've got enough for 3, maybe 4 days if we're careful. Storm won't last that long." Jack admired Thomas's certainty, whether he actually believed it or was just trying to reassure the frightened couple. It was exactly what they needed to hear. As if confirming Thomas's optimism, the wind outside began to slacken slightly, the constant roar diminishing to an intermittent howl. Pete noticed it first, his head tilting as he assessed the change. Pressure's rising, he observed. Storms starting to pass. "Should we check the other cars?" Jack suggested. "Might be more riders in trouble." Pete considered this. "Storm's still dangerous, but you're right. Now that these two are stabilizing, we should look for others." He turned to Thomas. "You stay with Robert and Emma. Maintain the shelter. Keep them warm. Jack and I will check the rest of the train." Thomas clearly wanted to join the rescue mission, but again accepted his father's logic without argument. His presence was needed here, keeping their shelter functional and the couple safe. Pete and Jack prepared for a longer expedition this time, planning to check every car they could reach safely. They tied more cord around their waists, creating a longer safety line, and packed small bundles of newspaper and emergency rations to leave with any riders they found. "The storm picks up again while we're out there. Return immediately," Pete instructed Thomas. "Don't wait for us. Maintain your shelter and stay alive." Thomas nodded solemnly, understanding that in winter survival, hard choices sometimes had to be made. Outside, the temperature remained brutally low, but the slightly reduced wind made movement more manageable. They worked their way forward, checking each car methodically. The next two cars were empty, but in the third they found an elderly man huddled near death in the corner. His extremities were already showing the blackened signs of severe frostbite. "Can we move him?" Jack asked, seeing the man's dire condition. Pete checked the man's pulse and responsiveness, his expression grim. "Too far gone to risk moving through this cold. We bring help to him instead." They quickly built a simple shelter around the old man using techniques Bill had taught them. They wrapped him in layers of newspaper and left him with emergency rations and instructions for when he regained consciousness. "Best we can do," Pete said regretfully. "Can't save everyone in conditions like these." They continued forward, finding two more riders in the next car, men with some winter experience who had created basic shelters but were running low on food. Pete shared emergency rations and improved their insulation techniques before moving on. Car by car, they worked their way almost halfway through the train, finding 7 more riders in various states of distress. To each, they provided what help they could: food for some, improved shelter techniques for others, medical attention for those with cold injuries. One more car. Then we turn back, Pete decided, the strain of the prolonged exposure beginning to show even through his expert insulation. Been out too long already. The final car they checked contained a group of 4 men who, unlike the others, seemed reasonably prepared. They had constructed a shelter similar to Pete's corner design and had food supplies that would last another day. "Newspaper, Pete?" one of them asked incredulously when Pete introduced himself. "Heard about you all over the rails. Your insulation method saved my brother in Colorado 2 winters back." "Just passing on what I learned," Pete replied with characteristic modesty. The men insisted on sharing some of their coffee, a rare luxury they'd been saving for emergencies. Pete and Jack gratefully accepted the hot drink, the warmth reviving them for the journey back to their own car. "Community," Pete observed as they carefully made their way back through the snow. That's what people don't understand about riding the rails. Think it's every man for himself. But winter creates bonds. Shared knowledge means shared survival. By the time they returned to their boxcar, the storm had weakened considerably, though snow was still falling. Inside, they found Thomas teaching Robert and Emma the finer points of the newspaper insulation method. "Figured they should know how to do it properly," Thomas explained. "For when they continue their journey." Pete nodded approvingly. Good thinking. Knowledge shared is lives saved. As evening approached, the wind died completely, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the occasional creak of the train's metal contracting in the cold. The temperature remained well below zero, but without the wind, their shelter easily maintained a survivable microclimate. They shared a meal from Sally's rations, carefully portioned to 5 equal shares. Despite the meagre size, the high-fat, high-calorie food provided substantial energy. Robert and Emma were fascinated by the specialized winter food systems Sally had designed. "Never would have thought of carrying food specifically because it stays edible when frozen," Robert admitted. "We brought sandwiches that turned into rocks within hours." "It's all learned knowledge," Pete explained. "Trial and error over many winters, riders figuring out what works, passing it along to others." As they ate, Thomas entertained them with stories from his 3-year search for his father. He'd ridden rails from California to New York, worked odd jobs in 24 states, and collected survival techniques from hundreds of fellow travelers. "Met a man in Montana who'd been an Arctic explorer before the crash wiped him out," Thomas recalled. "Taught me how to build snow shelters that can keep you alive even at 50 below. And you learned all this to find your father?" Emma asked, clearly moved by his dedication. Thomas nodded. "Worth every minute, even the hard parts." The simple statement brought a suspicious moisture to Pete's eyes that he quickly blinked away. Jack listened to father and son trading stories, each discovering the adventures and hardships the other had experienced during their years apart. Despite their dangerous situation, stranded in a blizzard with limited supplies, there was a warmth in the shelter that went beyond physical heat. As night fell, they established a watch rotation. Someone needed to stay awake to monitor the temperature, check for changes in the weather, and maintain the shelter. Pete took the first shift, insisting the others rest while they could. Jack found sleep came surprisingly easily despite the circumstances. The rhythmic breathing of the others, the cocoon-like warmth of their shared shelter, and the bone-deep exhaustion from the day's exertions all combined to pull him down into dreamless sleep. He woke to Thomas gently shaking his shoulder. "Your watch," Thomas whispered. "Storms passed completely. Stars are out." Jack carefully extracted himself from the shelter, trying not to disturb the others. Moving to the observation port, he was stunned by the transformation outside. The blizzard had given way to an absolutely clear sky filled with more stars than Jack had ever seen. The moon, nearly full, illuminated a landscape transformed into an alien world of wind-sculpted snow formations. The air was incredibly still, intensifying the brutal cold, but creating a scene of breathtaking beauty. The train sat motionless, half buried in massive drifts, looking like an abandoned relic from another age. In the moonlight, Jack could make out the tracks ahead, completely obliterated by snow that would require a specialized plow train to clear. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Pete's voice came quietly from behind him. "Always thought there's something special about the night after a blizzard, like the world's been wiped clean, given a fresh start." Jack nodded, understanding exactly what Pete meant. The pristine landscape, unmarked by human presence, offered a strange serenity despite the lethal cold it represented. "Couldn't sleep?" Jack asked. Pete shook his head. "Too much on my mind. Found my son after 3 years. Still processing it." He joined Jack at the observation port. "When you lose everything, home, work, purpose, you never expect to get any of it back. Just learn to live with the loss." "And now?" Jack prompted gently. Pete's weathered face held an expression Jack hadn't seen before, something like peace mixed with uncertainty. "Now I'm thinking about what comes next. For Thomas, for me." He hesitated, maybe even for Alice. The idea of rebuilding a family torn apart by the Depression seemed both impossible and essential, a microcosm of the national healing that would eventually be needed. "What will you do?" Jack asked. "When we reach St. Louis?" "Send a telegram to Alice," Pete decided. "Let her know Thomas is safe, that we're together. After that?" He shrugged. "One step at a time. Winter's not over yet." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, each lost in thoughts of what had been lost, what had been found, and what might still be possible in a country struggling through its darkest economic hours. "Get some rest," Jack finally told Pete. "I've got the watch." Pete nodded gratefully and returned to the shelter. Jack remained at the observation port, keeping vigil as the night deepened. Out in the stark moonlit landscape, he thought he saw movement, perhaps a wolf or coyote investigating the stalled mechanical beast that had invaded its territory. The creature paused, looking directly toward Jack's position, then turned and trotted away across the unmarred snow, a momentary connection across the divide between human and wild, between the technological world that had faltered so catastrophically and the natural world that continued, regardless of stock markets or human suffering. Jack checked his watch. 4 hours until dawn. 4 hours of this pristine, deadly beauty before the practical challenges of survival would again take precedence. He settled in for his watch, grateful for the knowledge that had kept them alive through the storm and for the unexpected community formed in this frozen boxcar in the middle of nowhere. Dawn broke over a world transformed. The blizzard had passed completely, leaving behind a landscape sculpted in white and blue shadows. The sun rose into a perfectly clear sky, its light diamond bright as it reflected off the endless snow. Jack watched the sunrise from their observation port, having maintained his vigil through the night. The temperature had dropped even further in the still air, what winter riders called a cold snap, but their shelter had held against it. Inside their insulated corner, 5 people had survived a night that would have killed them individually. "Train crew's moving," Jack called quietly to the others as he spotted distant figures trudging through the snow from the locomotive. Pete was instantly alert, emerging from sleep to full awareness without the groggy transition most people experienced. It was a skill Jack had noticed in experienced winter riders, the ability to wake completely at the first sign of change or potential danger. "Checking the track conditions," Pete assessed, joining Jack at the observation port, trying to determine if they can move forward or need to wait for a plough. Thomas stirred next, careful not to disturb Robert and Emma, who remained asleep, exhaustion still claiming them after their near-death experience. "How bad is it?" Thomas asked, his voice hushed. "Drifts higher than a man in places," Pete replied, "but the main line gets priority for clearing. Plough trains probably already heading this way from the division point." They watched as the train crew, engineer, fireman, and brakeman evaluated the snowdrifts blocking their path. The men moved with the careful deliberation of those who understood the danger of the cold surrounding them, their breaths forming huge clouds in the frigid air. 40 below, at least, Pete estimated. Maybe closer to 50 now that the winds dropped. The deadly temperature wasn't immediately obvious in the brilliant sunshine and pristine landscape. It was a beautiful killer, enticing the unprepared to admire its splendor until they noticed too late that they could no longer feel their extremities. Robert and Emma woke as the sun rose higher, its light finding cracks in the boxcar walls to stripe the interior with golden lines. They looked better than the previous day. Colour had returned to their faces, and the confused lethargy of hypothermia had been replaced with alert awareness. "We survived," Emma said with quiet wonder, looking around their shelter. "I really thought we were going to die in that storm." "Would have without Pete and Jack," Robert acknowledged. "Still don't understand how newspaper can keep you alive in this cold." "Air pockets," Thomas explained, slipping easily into the teaching role he'd learned from his father. "Paper traps thousands of tiny air bubbles. Air is actually an excellent insulator when it can't move. The layers trap your body heat instead of letting it escape." Pete nodded approvingly at his son's explanation. "Most folks think heavy layers equal warmth, but it's not weight that matters, it's trapped air. Newspaper's lighter than wool, but can work better if applied correctly." They shared a breakfast of Sally's carefully portioned rations: dried meat, nut paste, and a small piece of hard cheese for each person. The high-fat, high-protein meal provided essential energy without requiring cooking or preparation. Outside, activity increased as more crew members gathered near the front of the train. A distant whistle sounded, barely audible through the boxcar walls. "Plough train," Pete identified confidently. "Coming from the east, we'll be moving within a couple hours." His prediction proved accurate. By mid-morning, they heard the distinctive sound of the plough train approaching, the laboured chugging of multiple locomotives pushing a massive V-shaped plough that could cut through drifts taller than a man. "Smart design," Pete commented as they watched through the observation port. "Rotary ploughs work better, but are expensive to operate. V-ploughs can clear main lines efficiently with just brute force." Jack marvelled at Pete's encyclopedic knowledge of railroading. 3 years riding the rails had taught him more than most people would learn in a lifetime about the inner workings of America's transportation network. The plough train passed them heading west, clearing one track to allow supply trains through. It would return on the parallel track to clear their path eastward. The process was slow but methodical, the huge machines demonstrating humanity's determination to maintain movement even through nature's worst obstacles. By early afternoon, their train's whistle sounded 3 short blasts, the signal to prepare for departure. The welcome noise energized everyone in the boxcar. "We should check on the others before we leave," Jack suggested, remembering the elderly man with severe frostbite and the other riders they'd assisted. Pete nodded in agreement. "Thomas, you stay with Robert and Emma. Jack and I will make a quick round of the cars we visited yesterday." The improved weather made movement between cars much easier, though the cold remained life-threatening for anyone improperly protected. They found most riders in better condition than expected. The elderly man was conscious and responsive, his frostbitten extremities painful but not yet showing signs of dangerous infection. The other riders had maintained their improved shelters through the night and were eager for information about when the train would move again. "Heading out soon," Pete informed each group. "Might make St. Louis by tomorrow night if the tracks stay clear." When they returned to their boxcar, they found Thomas teaching Robert and Emma how to properly dismantle a shelter for quick packing, another critical winter riding skill. "Never know when you'll need to move fast," Thomas explained. "Bulls, unexpected stops, sudden weather changes. The rider who packs fastest lives longest." Pete watched his son with undisguised pride. "Boy's a natural teacher," got that from his mother. A sudden jerk announced the train's first movement in nearly 24 hours. Metal groaned as frozen components were forced into action. The initial progress was slow, the locomotive struggling against the resistance of packed snow between the rails. "We're moving," Emma said with relief bordering on joy. "Actually moving." Pete tempered their excitement with experienced caution. "Still a long way to St. Louis. Track could be blocked again further east, but yes, this is good progress." As the train gradually built speed, they began planning the next phase of their journey. Pete marked their approximate position on a mental map of the rail lines. "Should reach Jefferson City by nightfall if we maintain this pace," he calculated. "Then St. Louis by mid-morning tomorrow." "What will you do when we get there?" Robert asked. Pete and Thomas exchanged glances, the question bringing into focus decisions they needed to make. "First, send a telegram to Thomas's mother," Pete said. "Let her know he's safe, that we found each other." "Then," Jack prompted gently. Pete took a deep breath. "Then we need to decide if we head west, back to California, back to Alice." The possibility hung in the air between father and son, a potential ending to their years of separation and searching that neither had fully confronted until this moment. "What do you think, Thomas?" Pete asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Would your mother want me back after all this time?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "She never stopped waiting, kept your workshop exactly as you left it, said you'd need it when you came home." Pete looked away, emotion threatening to overcome his usual stoic demeanour. Jack and the newlyweds discreetly busied themselves with shelter maintenance, giving father and son a moment of privacy. "I'm not the same man who left," Pete said quietly to Thomas. "Lost my business, my home, been riding freights for 3 years. Don't know if I can go back to building houses, being a provider." "You've been providing in a different way," Thomas pointed out. "Teaching others to survive, saving lives. There's honour in that, like Jack said." Pete considered this perspective, that his years on the rails hadn't been a fall from grace, but a different kind of contribution. The idea seemed to ease something in his expression. "Maybe you're right," he conceded. "Still, California's a long way from St. Louis, especially in winter." "We could wait until spring," Thomas suggested. "Find work in St. Louis, save enough for proper tickets west. Riding a passenger train." Pete smiled at the notion. "Been a while since I did that." Their conversation shifted to practical considerations. Places to find work in St. Louis, known hobo jungles where they could stay safely, contacts Pete had made during previous visits to the city. Jack listened, realizing he hadn't considered his own next steps. He'd been so focused on helping Pete find Thomas that he hadn't thought beyond that goal. Now, with success unexpectedly achieved, he faced his own decision point. "What about you, Jack?" Thomas asked, intuitively sensing his thoughts. "Got plans after St. Louis?" Jack considered the question honestly. "Not really. Left Chicago with no destination in mind, just needed to get away." "From what?" Robert asked. "Memories, failure, lost everything in the crash, job at the bank, apartment, fiancé." Jack shrugged. "Thought I was leaving society behind when I jumped that freight. Turned out I was just finding a different kind of community." Pete regarded him thoughtfully. "You've got a knack for winter survival, quick learner, steady under pressure, rare combination." "High praise coming from you," Jack acknowledged with a small smile. "Could come west with us," Thomas suggested. "California's got more opportunities than most places these days." The invitation surprised Jack. He'd grown close to Pete and now Thomas, but hadn't expected to be included in their family reunion plans. "Something to consider," he said noncommittally. "Still plenty of track between here and St. Louis to make decisions." The train continued eastward through the afternoon, its pace improving as they moved beyond the worst of the storm's effects. The landscape gradually changed from the flat expanses of western Missouri to the more rolling terrain approaching the Mississippi River. Emma and Robert would leave them at Jefferson City, where her parents' farm was located just 10 miles north of town. "Don't know how to thank you enough," Robert said as they helped the couple prepare for departure. "We would have died without your help." "No thanks needed," Pete replied with characteristic directness. "Just remember what you learned. Pass it on to others when you can." Emma impulsively hugged each of them. "I'll never forget the newspaper method," she promised, "or the people who taught it to us." When they reached Jefferson City shortly after nightfall, the goodbyes were brief but heartfelt. Pete insisted on giving the couple some of Sally's remaining rations to sustain them on the final leg of their journey. "You don't have to do that," Robert protested. "You need these supplies yourselves." "Community," Pete said simply. "That's how survival works on the rails. Today, you need help. Tomorrow, you help someone else." As the train pulled away from Jefferson City, continuing east towards St. Louis, the boxcar felt emptier but somehow warmer for the connection they'd made with the young couple. Jack found himself hoping that Robert and Emma would reach her parents' farm safely, that they'd find security in a world where such things had become rare commodities. Should reach St. Louis by morning, Pete estimated, checking the star positions through the observation port. Might even make the big jungle before noon if we're lucky. "Iron Mike's place?" Thomas asked. "The one built into the bluff?" Pete nodded. "You've heard of it?" "Been there twice," Thomas confirmed. "Best winter setup east of the Mississippi. Natural cave systems expanded over years. Some chambers stay above freezing even in the worst cold." They exchanged information about the St. Louis jungle, discovering they knew many of the same people despite never crossing paths there. The rail rider community was like that, interconnected through shared knowledge, experiences, and survival techniques despite the vast distances involved. As night deepened, they maintained their shelter with practiced efficiency. The temperature outside remained brutally low, but their immediate survival was no longer in question. The train moved steadily eastward, each mile bringing them closer to St. Louis and the decisions that awaited them there. Jack took the first watch, settling into the now familiar routine of monitoring temperature changes, checking insulation integrity, and maintaining the shelter's structure. Pete and Thomas slept nearby, father and son reunited against all odds in the harsh winter of America's worst economic collapse. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails created a soothing background that made philosophical reflection almost inevitable. Jack found his thoughts drifting to the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a desperate, suicidal ex-banker with nothing to live for, boarding a freight train in Chicago with no destination and no knowledge of how to survive the journey. Now he was a competent winter rider with skills that could mean the difference between life and death in extreme conditions. More importantly, he'd found purpose again, first in helping Pete search for his son, then in assisting others like Robert and Emma who lacked the knowledge to survive on their own. There was meaning in that, a kind of redemption that had nothing to do with money or status. Pete stirred and joined him at the observation port. "Can't sleep," he admitted. "Too many thoughts." Jack nodded in understanding. "Big day tomorrow." "Been searching for Thomas for 3 years," Pete said quietly. "Now I've found him, and all I can think about is Alice, whether she'd want to see the man I've become." "You found your son because you became Newspaper Pete," Jack pointed out. "The man who teaches others to survive, the legend of the winter rails. Seems to me that's something to be proud of, not ashamed of." Pete considered this perspective. "Maybe you're right. Never thought of it that way." They watched the moonlit landscape pass in companionable silence. Tomorrow would bring St. Louis, telegrams to California, and decisions about futures that had seemed unimaginable just days before. "You should come west with us," Pete said suddenly. "If that's what we decide. Could use someone with your skills and level head." The invitation, coming from Pete directly, carried more weight than Thomas's casual suggestion. Jack was touched by the implicit acceptance into their small family unit. "I'll think about it," he promised, still trying to figure out where I fit in this world. "Know the feeling," Pete acknowledged. "Been doing that myself for 3 years." The night deepened around them, stars wheeling overhead as the train carried them eastward. In boxcars, all along the train, riders slept or kept watch, each with their own story of how the Depression had derailed their lives and set them on the steel roads crisscrossing America. Some, like Robert and Emma, were simply trying to reach family who could provide safety in desperate times. Others, like Pete and Thomas, were searching for lost connections, trying to rebuild what had been broken. And some, like Jack, were still discovering what they might become in a world where all previous certainties had vanished. Morning found them approaching St. Louis, the Mississippi River gleaming in the distance. The city's industrial skyline emerged from the morning mist, smokestacks already active despite the economic hardship that had emptied factories across the country. "Almost there," Pete announced, a complex mix of emotions in his voice: excitement, apprehension, hope, uncertainty. Thomas joined them at the observation port, his expression mirroring his father's. "Journey's end, for this part, anyway." Jack nodded, understanding exactly what Thomas meant. They had reached their physical destination, but the emotional journey was far from complete. Decisions remained, futures needed to be determined, new paths chosen. As the train slowed for its approach to the St. Louis yards, Pete began methodically packing his gear, his movements practiced and precise. "Bulls will be thick near the yards," he explained. "Need to be ready to move fast when we stop." Thomas and Jack followed his lead, dismantling their shelter and packing their supplies with the efficiency they'd learned through hard experience. Everything had its place, every item secured to prevent noise or loss during quick movement. The train's brakes engaged with a screech of metal on metal, beginning the final deceleration into the yards. Through the observation port, they could see the complex network of tracks spreading out, freight cars being sorted and redirected by yard workers bundled against the cold. "Remember the jump-off point?" Pete quizzed Thomas, continuing the teaching even in this moment of arrival. "East side of the yard," Thomas replied immediately, "behind the coal bunker, blind spot in the bull patrol route." Pete nodded approvingly. "Good. Jack, stay close to us. Yard bulls here are particularly nasty, known for beating riders unconscious and leaving them in the cold." The train slowed to walking pace as it entered the yard proper. Pete watched the passing landmarks with experienced eyes, counting the seconds until they reached the optimal exit point. "Ready," he said tensely. "When I say jump, we go together. Roll when you hit the ground to absorb impact, then up and run directly east toward the tree line. Don't stop until you reach cover." Jack's heart pounded with familiar fear and excitement. Despite everything he'd learned, jumping from moving trains never became routine. "Now," Pete called as they reached the position he'd been waiting for. They slid the door wider and jumped in quick succession, landing in snow that cushioned their fall. As instructed, Jack rolled, came up smoothly, and ran toward the distant trees without looking back. Pete and Thomas flanked him, their movements similarly fluid from long practice. They reached the tree line without raising an alarm, pausing there to catch their breath and adjust their packs. "Made it," Pete said with satisfaction. "Jungle's about 2 miles east, built into the bluff overlooking the river." As they began walking through the snowy woods, Jack felt a curious mixture of achievement and anticipation. They had survived a journey that would have killed most people, finding each other in the process. What came next was unwritten, full of both possibility and uncertainty. The morning sun filtered through bare branches, creating dappled patterns on the snow at their feet. Their breath clouded around them in the still frigid air, but the deadly cold of the previous days had moderated slightly. Winter remained dangerous, but its worst fury had passed for now. "What do you think your mother will say when she gets our telegram?" Pete asked Thomas, his voice casual, though the question was anything but. Thomas considered this for a moment. "She'll cry, then she'll start packing, then she'll probably scold both of us for worrying her." Pete laughed, a warm, genuine sound rarely heard during their dangerous journey. "That sounds exactly like Alice." Jack watched the father and son walking ahead of him, their movements and mannerisms so similar despite their years apart. Some connections, it seemed, transcended time and distance and economic disaster. As for himself, Jack wasn't sure what awaited him in St. Louis or beyond. California with Pete and Thomas remained a possibility, as did continuing his solitary journey once they parted ways. What he did know was that he was no longer the desperate man who had boarded that freight in Chicago, ready to end it all. He had skills now, knowledge that could keep himself and others alive in the most extreme conditions. He understood the winter rails in ways few people ever would, the dangers they presented and the community they created among those who rode them. Most importantly, he had discovered something the Depression had almost convinced him no longer existed: the capacity of people to help each other when systems failed, to share knowledge when institutions collapsed, to form communities when society itself seemed to be crumbling. Between 1929 and 1941, over 2 million Americans would ride the freight trains, many during winter months when temperatures made survival a daily battle. They developed techniques that sustained life in conditions more extreme than Arctic expeditions, using only materials found in railroad yards and abandoned lots. These weren't summer joyrides, but desperate journeys where exposure could kill within minutes. The newspaper insulation method, corner shelter construction, and specialized food strategies weren't just clever tricks. They were the difference between life and death on steel roads that stretched across a nation in crisis. As Jack followed Pete and Thomas toward the St. Louis jungle and whatever future awaited them there, he carried with him not just the survival knowledge they had shared, but the more profound understanding that had come with it. Even in the coldest, darkest moments, human ingenuity and community could create warmth where none should exist. The winter rails had nearly killed him, then taught him how to live. As you drift towards sleep in your warm, safe bed, perhaps you might appreciate how different your comfort is from the desperate journeys of those who rode America's frozen rails during its darkest economic hours, finding in each other the knowledge and community that meant survival for one more night.